Hello, fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to drift. You've found Sleepless Homo, a space for tired minds who still want to know how it all began. Here, history moves slowly. I wander through deep time, guided not by noise or hype, but by quiet curiosity, the kind that stays awake when the world goes dark. Imagine a planet that never slept. 4 billion years ago, the young Earth spun faster than it does today. A full day passed in less than 14 hours. Light and darkness arrived in relentless succession. Heat and cold, radiation and calm repeating like a heartbeat that never rested. Every living molecule had to keep pace with the turning planet or be torn apart by it. The first photosynthetic organisms, the ancient cyanobacteria, learned to harvest light by day and to survive darkness by night. In their fragile colonies, something began to change. Chemistry started keeping time. The earliest life did not plan ahead. It reacted, it endured, it adapted one molecule at a time. But on this spinning, violent world, predictability became a kind of superpower. The organisms that could anticipate sunrise had an advantage over those that merely endured it. In the shallow seas of the Archean, roughly 3.5 billion years ago, cyanobacteria were building the planet's first great monuments, layered stromatolites that still stand as the fossilized calendars of early metabolism. Beneath each layer of calcium carbonate lies a record of daily activity. Photosynthesis when light returned, dormancy when it vanished. The alternating bands are not random. They are the earliest signatures of rhythm, the beginning of something that would one day resemble sleep. To live was to dance to the sun's rotation. The ultraviolet radiation of those early days was lethal, and nighttime was the only shelter the biosphere had. In darkness, the atmosphere cooled and chemistry shifted from energy harvesting to repair. DNA damaged by solar light could only be mended when photons stopped striking it. Rest became survival. The line between life and death was measured not in hours but in oscillations, on-off light, dark, activity, recovery. For billions of years, that simple alternation sculpted the flow of life, long before there were neurons or eyes or brains to perceive it. Within those microscopic bodies, tiny loops of protein began to keep score. Cyanobacteria developed internal clocks made of feedback cycles between molecules now known as 𝐏-A, 𝐏-B, and 𝐏-C. These proteins interact to maintain roughly 24-hour rhythms, even when isolated in laboratory glassware. They are molecular gears, ticking independently of the outside world, but synchronized by the rising and setting of the sun. In those ancient seas, every cell carried its own sun-shaped memory, an inherited expectation that light would return. This was not yet sleep, not consciousness, but it was the foundation of rest as an adaptive pattern. The invention of rhythmic biochemistry meant organisms could begin to schedule their vulnerability. During the bright hours, cyanobacteria performed photosynthesis, releasing oxygen and reshaping the planet's atmosphere. At night, they turned inward, fixing nitrogen, repairing damage, balancing what the day had broken. The planet itself was learning to breathe through them. Inhale, light, exhale, darkness. Over time, this oscillation became so successful that it rewrote evolution's script. Any species that ignored the rhythm was outcompeted by those that obeyed it. Around 2.5 billion years ago, during what geologists call the Great Oxidation Event, the chemistry of life and the chemistry of the sky collided. The oxygen produced by these rhythmic bacteria transformed the planet's atmosphere, paving the way for more complex metabolisms, but also poisoning many of the microbes that had thrived in anoxic seas. Yet even extinction could not erase the pattern. The rhythm was too useful. Organisms that could tell time survived. The circadian system had become a biological law, one that would eventually govern everything from cyanobacteria to primates. The shift from mere reaction to anticipation marked one of the quiet revolutions of Earth's history. When the first cells began predicting dawn, life took its first step toward memory. The simplest clockwork inside those organisms represented something profound. A record of the environment written into protein loops. It meant that living things were no longer purely at the mercy of chance. They carried the planet's spin within them. In the Archean oceans, light was not uniform. Clouds of volcanic ash dimmed the sky, while meteor impacts occasionally darkened it entirely. Yet through every fluctuation, the cyanobacterial clock persisted, adjusting but never abandoning its cycle. This persistence suggests that circadian regulation was not merely a byproduct of solar exposure, it was a selectable advantage. Cells that could align their metabolism to the planet's predictable day-night oscillation expended less energy on constant reaction. They could prepare enzymes before sunrise, anticipate the cooling of night, and coordinate internal chemistry with external conditions. As oxygen accumulated and ozone began filtering radiation, life expanded into new niches. Some organisms ventured into deeper water, where light flickered but never disappeared. Their clocks evolved differently, adapting to gradients of brightness rather than sharp boundaries. Others colonized tidal flats, where the alternation of wet and dry added a second rhythm atop the first. Every environmental cycle, from tides to seasons, would later nest inside the same principle, internal timing as an evolutionary scaffold. If we could compress those billions of years into a single breath, we would see a planet synchronizing itself. From molecular machines inside bacteria to photosynthetic blooms following the sun across the surface, everything was beginning to pulse in unison. The alternation of day and night was not just an environmental condition, it was becoming an internal architecture. Energy use, repair, replication, even gene expression all followed the invisible hand of the clock. Today, every plant that closes its leaves at dusk, every coral that releases eggs under the moon, every human who feels drowsy at sunset is reenacting that ancient choreography. The circadian rhythm is not a human invention, it is planetary muscle memory. The fact that a cluster of cyanobacterial proteins can still keep 24-hour time in a test tube is evidence of deep continuity. The same logic that once guided microbial repair now guides your sleep. It is humbling to imagine that our nightly descent into rest echoes a molecular decision made nearly 4 billion years ago. To conserve energy in darkness, to survive until morning. That rhythm survived the rise of continents, mass extinctions and ice ages. It passed through the genetic corridors of eukaryotes, fungi, plants and animals, diversifying but never disappearing. Even organisms without eyes, like deep-sea worms or cave fish, retain circadian patterns, a ghost of the ancient light still ticking inside them. What began as chemistry under a blazing sky slowly became physiology. The selective value of timing laid the groundwork for more elaborate regulatory networks. In multicellular life, clusters of cells began to coordinate their cycles, forming tissues that rested and reactivated together. Energy conservation, repair and anticipation intertwined. Evolution discovered that coordination is cheaper than chaos. The idea of rest as a structured pause rather than random fatigue was born. This early planetary rhythm also shaped the biosphere's metabolism on a global scale. Photosynthesis during daylight drew carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, while nighttime respiration released it again. The fluctuations stabilized temperatures and influenced climate long before humans ever measured it. The planet's habitability was literally maintained by life's collective need to rest and recover. In that sense, Earth did not just host sleep, it required it. If you could stand beside an Archean shore and watch the waves shimmer with microscopic light, you would see the first sleepers in history. Colonies of cells dimming as the sun dipped below the horizon, their biochemistry shifting into maintenance mode. They were not aware, not dreaming, but their collective behaviour already mirrored what would later become universal, the need to stop, to repair, to prepare for tomorrow. The rhythm that began with cyanobacteria would eventually fuse with the internal timing systems of more complex organisms. When eukaryotes appeared, their mitochondria, descendants of once free-living bacteria, brought their own rhythmic tendencies into host cells. The result was a nested hierarchy of clocks, from subcellular loops to whole organism cycles. Each beat of this rhythm represented balance between survival and vulnerability. The entire planet was learning to rest without dying. Scientists today can still trace the molecular lineage of those early clocks. The feedback loops that regulate human sleep share structural similarities with those bacterial proteins. The conservation of this mechanism across billions of years tells us that timekeeping is not an accessory of life. It is life. Even when environments changed drastically, the logic remained. Activity aligned with opportunity, recovery aligned with risk. And yet, even now, we cannot fully explain why rhythmic rest became indispensable. We can observe it, measure it, manipulate it in laboratory organisms, but its original emergence remains partly hidden in geological time. It is one of those mysteries that science approaches with humility. We know it works, we know it endures, but the moment it became essential is lost in the haze of deep time. Perhaps that uncertainty is fitting. After all, sleep itself is an act of trust, an agreement between vulnerability and survival. If you think about it, the first circadian rhythms were the universe's way of marking continuity. Before life, there were only physical cycles, planetary rotations, orbital seasons, tidal waves. With biology came the internalization of those cycles, the first subjective sense of when. From there, the story of sleep begins not as a human tale, but as a planetary one. The Earth learning to coordinate its own heartbeat through the organisms it carried. Every night when you drift into stillness, your cells are reenacting that same ancient compromise. You're not withdrawing from life, you're aligning with it. Somewhere inside, molecular switches inherited from those cyanobacteria flip from day to night, conserving energy and repairing damage just as they did in the shallow seas of the Archean. You are, in the quietest possible way, echoing the planet's oldest reflex. And if this entire chain of reasoning seems too poetic for chemistry, remember that science often begins in awe. We can sequence the genes, reconstruct the feedback loops, and simulate their oscillations, but what they represent, a planet that needed a pause, is still more than the sum of its mechanisms. It is the story of life learning to survive not by fighting every moment, but by trusting the dark. We're humble researchers, storytellers, and sleepless thinkers, tracing the long, soft evolution that made you possible. If this helps you rest, focus, or simply drift, you're in the right place. Tell us where you listen. Before sleep, at work, on the road, or through headphones in the dark. And if you drift off halfway, the timestamps will bring you back when morning comes. A calm tap on like, or subscribe, helps this small corner of science reach other sleepless sapiens out there. So close your eyes, or don't. Time is patient here, and as always, stay curious, stay calm. Imagine this, a world with no eyes, no sound, no predators, just soft bodies drifting through shallow ancient seas. It is roughly 600 million years ago, near the end of the Ediacaran period, and the Earth has finally begun to breathe in rhythm. For billions of years, life has known timing but not awareness. The planet already had its clocks, but not yet its nerves. Now the first sparks of sensation are flickering through tissues that have never felt before. Something extraordinary is happening beneath the waves. Organisms are beginning to respond not only to chemistry, but to touch, to light, to the pulse of the environment. The birth of the nervous system is the birth of experience itself, and with it came, perhaps for the very first time, the need to rest that experience. The earliest animals were nothing like the complex creatures that would follow. They were slow, soft, and often immobile. sponges, nasarians, comb jellies. Many lacked brains entirely. Yet even among these primitive beings, scientists today find clues of a pattern that looks suspiciously like sleep. Jellyfish, for example, do not have a central brain, only a loose net of neurons called a nerve net. And yet modern experiments show that they undergo cycles of activity and quiescence, periods when their pulsing slows, their responses dull, and their bodies drift downward in the water column as if surrendering to gravity. When disturbed, they can wake, resume movement, and, most tellingly, if deprived of these quiet intervals, they compensate later with longer, deeper stillness. This rebound effect is one of the hallmarks of sleep, even if no dreams flicker behind their translucent bells. If such behaviour exists in animals so ancient, it suggests that rest is not an invention of complex brains, but a property of neurons themselves. The emergence of nervous systems brought not only new forms of activity, but also the biological debt of activity. Neurons, once evolved, needed recovery time. Chemical exhaustion, ion imbalance, and the build-up of metabolic waste all made uninterrupted firing impossible. Sleep-like states, in this light, may have been the first maintenance protocol in the history of sensation, a quiet housekeeping that accompanied the gift of awareness. When the Ediacaran seas filled with oxygen after eons of low concentrations, it allowed animals to grow larger, to move, to coordinate their cells in ways bacteria never could. But this new metabolism came with energy costs. Neural tissue, even in its earliest form, consumes extraordinary amounts of energy relative to its size. Every signal fired through a nerve required the careful pumping of ions across membranes, sodium and potassium exchanged like clockwork, powered by ATP. And every firing introduced microscopic instability, tiny chemical imbalances that had to be reset. So the first nervous systems were not just conduits of information, they were fragile, constantly on the brink of depletion. To function, they needed periodic silence. Some researchers suggest that the invention of inhibition, the ability of one neuron to tell another to stop, was as important as the invention of excitation. To sense the world, the early nervous systems needed contrast, moments of activity alternating with stillness. Inhibition, at its most fundamental level, is the neural version of rest. The alternation of firing and quieting that defines modern sleep may therefore be the direct descendant of this primordial architecture. Long before dreams or REM cycles, long before mammals or even fish, the sea itself may have pulsed with a daily pattern of neuronal silence and reawakening. During the Cambrian explosion, roughly 540 million years ago, this silent logic blossomed into complexity. Predators emerge for the first time, creatures with eyes, limbs, and coordinated movement. Vision and movement are expensive operations for the brain. They require the rapid processing of sensory input and the constant updating of position and strategy. The animals that could hunt or flee effectively had to manage enormous neural traffic. And yet, the same neurons that fired so fast needed recovery more urgently than ever. The fossil record of the Cambrian doesn't show sleep, but the neurophysiology of modern descendants like flatworms, annelids, and arthropods suggests that quiescent states became more structured as brains grew larger. The more complex the circuit, the more necessary the pause. Sleep, in that ancient context, was not leisure. It was repair. A creature that never rested its sensory system would soon lose its ability to respond accurately to the environment. Its thresholds would dull, its reflexes slow, its neural gradients collapse. Rest was survival. The nervous system, freshly born from the sea's chemistry, was learning that the only way to stay responsive was to sometimes stop responding. One can imagine those early nights beneath the shallow waves, fields of strange animals like Dickinsonia and Sprigina flattening against the seafloor, slowing their pulsing oscillatory waves their nerve nets dimming to a metabolic whisper. In the absence of eyes or consciousness, their sleep would not have been an experience but a state, a temporary deactivation of response, a return to baseline. And yet, in that absence lay the foundation for every sleeping creature that would follow. Modern neuroscience offers glimpses of what those transitions might have looked like. When researchers measure electrical patterns in jellyfish or simple worms, they find slow oscillations, the same rise and fall of neural potentials that define deeper sleep in mammals. These are primitive versions of what later became organized waves, bursts of synchronized silence rippling through neural tissue. It is as though the earliest nervous systems discovered rhythm again, this time not the rhythm of day and night, but the rhythm of activity and recovery inside their own circuits. The homeostatic rebound observed in even the simplest animals tells us that rest is not just a response to fatigue. It is an actively maintained state, enforced by internal mechanisms. Deprive a jellyfish of rest, and it will later compensate by resting longer. Deprive a nematode worm, and its tiny nervous system shows stress responses similar to ours. Altered gene expression, slower reflexes, reduced longevity. This is not coincidence. It is continuity. Sleep, or whatever proto-sleep looked like then, became a universal repair tool for any nervous tissue that had to last more than a few days. We often think of evolution as a story of invention, but much of it is refinement. The first neurons did not evolve to think, but to sense. Sleep evolved not to dream, but to maintain those senses. Even the most minimal nervous networks still face the same constraint. Signal transmission cannot go on forever without restoration. The brain, whether it belongs to a jellyfish or a human, is a device that burns itself out unless it pauses. Rest is the cost of consciousness, however faint that consciousness may be. There is an odd symmetry here. The same ocean that once taught cyanobacteria to follow the rhythm of the sun now teaches animals to follow the rhythm of exhaustion and recovery. Where once light dictated activity, now internal signals dictate it. In both cases, life is learning to self-regulate. To sense the world is to incur damage. To rest is to repair it. The alternation is written into the biology of time itself. We can trace hints of this lineage in modern molecular genetics. Many of the genes involved in regulating circadian cycles also modulate neuronal rest in simple organisms. The feedback loops that coordinate metabolic timing overlap with those that govern neural inhibition. In the sea anemone Nematostella vectensis, a relative of early cnidarians, genes linked to human sleep regulation, such as those controlling melatonin-like molecules, show cyclical activity patterns even though the creature has no eyes and lives in constant dimness. It means that the roots of sleep are molecular as much as they are behavioural. The architecture was present long before vertebrates, waiting to be elaborated into dreams. The Cambrian marked the beginning of a nervous complexity, but the principle of rest remained humble. Sleep was never an evolutionary luxury. It was maintenance disguised as silence. Whether in a worm's ganglia or a cephalopod's brain, the pattern stayed the same. A period of reduced responsiveness, followed by a rebound of sensitivity and learning. The world was getting louder, brighter, faster, but evolution had already invented the mute button. If we could observe one of those early nights through time's slow lens, we would see the ocean darken under a rising moon that no creature yet noticed. The water would shimmer faintly with bioluminescent bacteria, ancestors of future circadian keepers. Among them, translucent bodies would slow their movements, nerve impulses decelerating, chemical signals stabilizing. It would look peaceful, but what we'd be watching was one of evolution's most consequential pauses, the moment sensation learned how to turn itself off. Modern science is still cautious about calling this true sleep. Without consciousness, without dreams, can we really say these creatures slept? Perhaps not in the human sense, but the defining features, reduced activity, decreased response to stimuli, compensatory rebound are all there. What we call sleep today may simply be the elaboration of a much older process. When neurons appeared, the need for recovery came with them, like a shadow following firelight. Every neuron today carries that heritage. Each one alternates between firing and resting, between electrical charge and quiet equilibrium. Sleep is this pattern scaled up to the whole organism. We may imagine sleep as a holistic state, but it is also a cellular negotiation, millions of tiny silences coordinating to rebuild the machinery of perception. The idea that our nightly rest echoes 1 billion years of adaptation is not romantic, it is empirical. We are the latest inheritors of a biological rhythm that began when the first animals twitched, and still, we do not fully understand how the brain generates the need to sleep. We know about neurotransmitters, gene expression, circadian control, but not the full logic. Perhaps the question itself is misplaced. Maybe sleep does not need a purpose beyond balance. Maybe it is simply what neurons do when they stop pretending they can fire forever. The same humility that keeps scientists cautious keeps life alive. To endure, you must rest. So the next time you close your eyes and feel the weight of awareness fading, remember that you are performing an ancient act, not learned but inherited. The same quiet state that steadied the first nerve net still runs beneath your skull. Your rest tonight is their rhythm continued. The neurons that made you possible learned long ago that perception must occasionally give way to stillness. That, more than anything, is how nerves learn to last. Imagine this. A creature drifts in the ancient sea, eyes half open. One side of its brain is awake, the other silent. Muscles move with effortless rhythm, gills flutter, the tail sways. But part of the animal is elsewhere, immersed in a quiet internal night. This is not the full surrender of sleep that we know. It is vigilance divided, a mind split by necessity. The Devonian oceans, roughly 400 million years ago, were no place for complete rest. There were predators in every direction, and for animals that had to keep moving to breathe, unconsciousness was a luxury evolution could not afford. The earliest fishes faced an impossible problem: how to pause without stopping, how to sleep without dying. The water around them was dense with oxygen-poor zones, shifting currents, and constant threat. Even brief stillness could mean suffocation or predation. And yet, neurons still needed to rest. The metabolic strain of constant movement, sensory awareness, and coordination was immense. Evolution's answer was not more wakefulness, but more precision. Rest divided into halves. Modern lampreys and sharks still hint at what this early compromise may have looked like. In many species, periods of reduced activity alternate with slow, rhythmic fin movements and open eyes. The brain enters patterns of lowered electrical activity in certain regions while others remain alert, processing visual and lateral line input. It is not sleep as we define it, but it is a beginning, a distributed stillness rather than total shutdown. Even in these primitive systems, the brain appears to oscillate between modes of vigilance and recovery, like waves rolling across a restless shore. By the late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic eras, as vertebrates began conquering new environments, amphibians testing the edge of land, reptiles gliding through marine ecosystems, this problem of sleeping in motion grew more complex. When air breathing evolved, sleep gained a new danger. The surface became a lifeline. For any creature that had to surface periodically to breathe, complete unconsciousness risked drowning. Evolution responded again with extraordinary ingenuity, the partitioning of consciousness itself. In modern times, we can observe this adaptation most clearly in marine mammals like dolphins and seals, and in certain species of birds. They exhibit what scientists call unihemispheric slow-wave sleep. one half of the brain entering deep rest while the other remains active and aware. One eye closes, connected to the sleeping hemisphere. The other stays open, scanning for predators, companions, or the next breath of air. While the sleeping side of the brain shows the slow oscillations typical of deep rest, the awake side maintains normal alert patterns. Every few hours they switch. The animal wakes one hemisphere and lets the other sleep. It is the ultimate biological multitasking, a compromise between survival and recovery. But to reach this sophistication, nature spent hundreds of millions of years experimenting. Fossil evidence can only hint at behaviour, yet comparative anatomy offers clues. The lateralization of vertebrate brains, the division of labour between hemispheres, appears ancient, present even in early fishes. In species like lungfish, certain reflexes and motor functions are handled asymmetrically, suggesting that one side of the brain can maintain vital rhythms while the other enters a reduced state. Neural asymmetry may have first evolved for efficiency, but it inadvertently laid the foundation for divided sleep. Consider an early air-breathing reptile gliding through a warm Mesozoic lagoon. The air is heavy, the night full of motion. This animal surfaces every few minutes, takes in a breath, then sinks back into the darkness. Its brain cannot fully rest, yet it cannot stay awake forever. The hemispheres alternate in responsibility, the right controlling surfacing and breath, the left drifting toward the chemical quiet of rest. Each side guards the other's sleep. For birds, who inherited this system from reptilian ancestors, the adaptation took a new form. Migratory species capable of flying for days or weeks without landing display clear unihemispheric sleep while in flight. One hemisphere sleeps while the other monitors wing position and orientation, keeping the bird aloft. They can even align their open eye toward the direction of potential threat, scanning for obstacles or predators while resting mid-air. The boundary between waking and sleep becomes porous, a sliding scale rather than a switch. In seals and sea lions, this pattern blurs depending on environment. When they are at sea, they use unihemispheric sleep to surface for air without drowning. When they haul out on land, they shift to the more familiar bilateral sleep used by terrestrial mammals. The brain's ability to toggle between these modes shows how flexible evolution can be when survival demands balance. Sleep was never a single invention. It was a system continuously revised by circumstance. Even in fish that do not surface for air, partial or localized rest appears common. Some reef fishes and sharks enter states where muscle tone remains but responsiveness drops dramatically. Electroencephalographic studies show regional slowing of brain activity without full global sleep. The body moves through the water, the eyes remain open, but part of the brain is off. These animals are in essence half asleep, an ancient solution repeated across time and taxa. When scientists first documented unihemispheric sleep in dolphins during the late 20th century, it challenged the very definition of what it means to be awake. How can half of an animal be conscious while the other half is not? Yet the data were unambiguous. Eye closure alternated sides, and each hemisphere's electrical patterns oscillated independently. It was as if evolution had learned to sculpt rest into a moving rhythm, a perpetual travelling wave of sleep that never fully ceased. Why such a system evolved likely ties to three pressures: predation, respiration, and social coordination. In open water, vigilance is life. A single moment of unawareness could invite attack. For air-breathing marine mammals, surfacing is a reflex that must continue even when resting. And for social species that travel in groups, coordinated vigilance helps maintain cohesion. If every individual slept at once, the pod would drift apart. By sleeping in turns internally, the group as a whole stays synchronized. Night for these creatures is not surrender. It is organized surveillance. The neural basis of unihemispheric sleep is as elegant as it is mysterious. In bilateral sleep, inhibitory signals from brainstem nuclei spread across both hemispheres, inducing synchronized slow waves. In divided sleep, those signals are asymmetrically distributed. One side receives inhibition, the other continues operating at wake-like levels. The corpus callosum, the bridge connecting the hemispheres in mammals, may help modulate this division. In animals where it is reduced or absent, like dolphins, each hemisphere operates more independently, allowing sleep to localize. Birds achieve a similar pattern through specialized commissural circuits that permit one side of the brain to ignore the other. It is not that the animal chooses which side sleeps. The switch occurs automatically, guided by metabolic and sensory cues. To humans, this may sound alien, yet even our own brains retain a trace of it. Studies show that when people sleep in unfamiliar environments, the so-called first night effect, one hemisphere remains slightly more alert than the other, monitoring for disturbances. It is a faint echo of the vigilance that once defined survival. We may not open one eye to watch for predators, but deep within our physiology the asymmetry persists. In the Devonian and Mesozoic seas, this system was tested again and again. As marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs adapted to life fully in the water, the need for continuous respiration and awareness would have made complete sleep dangerous. Although no fossil can record electrical activity, the anatomical features of these animals, large optic lobes, asymmetric skulls, and constant need to surface, suggest that some form of unihemispheric rest was probable. The logic is too consistent across modern analogues to ignore. Through this lens, sleep begins to look less like a single behaviour and more like a spectrum, a continuum of neural disengagement fine-tuned to the ecological risks of each species. Where danger is low, bilateral sleep dominates. Where threat or environmental demand persists, the brain fragments its rest, spreading it across hemispheres or even across regions. The purpose remains constant: recovery without vulnerability. If one could hover invisibly above a Mesozoic coastline, the night would shimmer with quiet motion. Reptilian swimmers breaking the surface to breathe, each eye glinting faintly under starlight, some of them half dreaming, half scanning the dark. Above them, early birds roosting on cliffs, one eye closed to the wind, the other fixed on the sky. The night would not be silent, but it would be calm, a world that never fully sleeps, yet never fully wakes. And this arrangement, paradoxical as it seems, may have taught evolution an important lesson. Rest does not require unconsciousness. Recovery can coexist with awareness. The brain, it turns out, is capable of dividing its labour not just across time, but across space. By allowing half to guard while half restores, nature found a middle path between vigilance and vulnerability. We still don't know when this capacity first emerged. Did the Devonian fish already possess primitive hemispheric specialization? Did early amphibians show partial asymmetry during rest? The fossil record cannot tell us, but the convergence across such distant lineages suggests that the principle is ancient. Whenever the cost of full sleep outweighed its benefits, evolution built compromise into the brain's wiring. Sleep was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be possible. Imagine this. The great reptiles still rule the planet, and night is the only refuge left. The air hums with the low calls of insects, and in the undergrowth, something small and warm is awake when the giants sleep. It moves softly through the shadows, its heartbeat quick, its body hot for its size. In its skull, the first true mammalian brain glows with activity, learning to live in darkness. It will never outmuscle the dinosaurs, so it adapts in another way. It learns to use the night as shelter and to pay for survival with energy, warmth, and eventually sleep itself. This is the world of the late Triassic, more than 200 million years ago, when the ancestors of mammals faced a difficult equation. How to remain alive and warm on a planet dominated by cold-blooded titans. The solution was to shrink and to burn. Endothermy, the ability to generate internal heat, became their defining trait, but it came at a steep metabolic price. Warm-blooded life requires constant energy, and every heartbeat drains resources faster. In this economy of survival, sleep evolved into a more deliberate investment, a nightly surrender that conserved energy and repaired what the heat had worn down. The first mammals were tiny, mostly nocturnal insect hunters, perhaps weighing no more than a few ounces. In the daylight, they would have been easy prey for archosaurs and early dinosaurs. But in the dark, their new senses, sensitive ears, keen noses, and touch-sensitive whiskers, gave them an advantage. Night favoured small, warm and alert creatures. Yet to keep this rhythm sustainable, the brain and body needed deeper, more efficient rest. Shallow quiescence would not suffice for an organism burning through calories to stay warm. The mammalian brain responded by deepening its sleep, packing restoration into fewer, denser hours. When scientists today measure the sleep of modern mammals, they find an extraordinary range in duration and intensity, but a consistent principle. The smaller and hotter the animal, the more time it must spend resting. A shrew, whose heart can beat 1,000 times per minute, may sleep for over half its day. An elephant, massive and slow, can survive on only a few hours. The metabolic cost of life is repaid in sleep, and the mammalian lineage may have perfected that trade during its nocturnal phase. In those early ages, every calorie mattered, and deep rest was one of the few ways to stretch survival time. Nocturnality also shaped the architecture of the mammalian brain. When light fades, vision weakens and other senses must compensate. The auditory and olfactory centres expanded, demanding larger neural circuits and more synaptic maintenance. This neural complexity required more restorative downtime to recalibrate, to clear waste, and to re-establish chemical gradients. Sleep thus deepened not as a luxury but as a cost of intelligence. The brain that could navigate darkness and smell danger also needed longer, more profound repair. Thermoregulation introduced a second pressure. A small warm-blooded body loses heat quickly. During wakefulness, metabolic heat can be maintained through movement and feeding, but during rest, that activity halts. Deep sleep likely evolved in part to minimize energy loss. A state of lowered temperature, slowed heart rate, and reduced breathing that conserved fuel through the long cold hours before dawn. This is seen today in animals that enter torpor, a controlled descent into near hibernation where the boundaries between sleep and energy saving blur. Evolution may have used these same physiological levers to stretch nighttime endurance in its first mammals. In the fossil record, traces of this adaptation can be found not in bones, but in the shapes of skulls and the delicate impressions of inner ear canals. These structures reveal that early mammals and their close relatives had expanded middle ears and enlarged cochleae, tuned to low-frequency sounds typical of nocturnal life. The bones of the snout became narrower, accommodating sensitive whiskers for tactile exploration in darkness. Some species even developed fur insulation, an evolutionary investment in heat retention that allowed their metabolism and their sleep to stabilize through the cold. By the time the dinosaurs dominated the continents in the Jurassic and Cretaceous, mammals had retreated almost entirely into the shadows. Their small size made them unremarkable to predators, but their physiology was undergoing quiet revolutions. Fossilized bones show growth rings that may represent cycles of activity and rest, suggesting that metabolic rhythms, perhaps even daily sleep cycles, had already become tightly regulated. The nocturnal bottleneck was more than an ecological niche. It was a crucible in which the mammalian nervous system refined its timing, energy management, and depth of restoration. To imagine one of these small Triassic mammals sleeping is to picture a fragile but remarkable equilibrium. It curls into a burrow or crevice, body temperature dropping slightly to save fuel. Its heartbeat slows, its muscles relax, but its ears remain twitching at the faintest sound. Sleep for this creature cannot be a full collapse into oblivion. It is measured, layered, cautious. Predators roam above, and any noise, a branch snapping, a shift in the wind, can trigger instant wakefulness. This is the evolutionary tension at the heart of all mammalian sleep, the balance between vulnerability and repair. The deeper the sleep, the greater the renewal, but also the greater the risk of never waking. As the Mesozoic world gave way to the Cenozoic and dinosaurs vanished from most ecosystems, the mammals that emerged into the daylight were no longer purely nocturnal, but they carried the legacy of the night within them. Their thermoregulation, sensory systems and sleep architecture all bore marks of that long twilight apprenticeship. Even when many species evolved to hunt or forage by day, their biological clocks retained the memory of nocturnal ancestors. Hormones like melatonin, still secreted at night to regulate sleep timing, trace directly back to this era. The mammalian brain, it seems, was built to rest best under darkness. The depth of mammalian sleep has measurable advantages. During the slowest waves of rest, the brain's electrical activity synchronizes across vast networks, reducing energy use while allowing physical repair at the cellular level. Growth hormones surge, protein synthesis accelerates, and damaged tissues recover. Muscles and bones rebuild microscopic fractures caused by daily movement. The immune system resets. All these processes take place when body temperature dips and metabolic demands ease, conditions perfected by the nocturnal lifestyle. Sleep became a nightly maintenance cycle for warm-blooded complexity, but the cost never vanished. The deep stillness that enabled such restoration also amplified risk. Unlike reptiles, which could maintain low-level awareness through simple sensory systems, mammals evolved large brains that required total disengagement to recalibrate. For an animal in the open, this was perilous. Evolution compensated through behavioral ingenuity, nesting, burrowing, clustering, and timing. Safety was externalized through strategy. Some species slept in groups, taking turns as guards. Others found natural shelters or synchronized their rest with environmental cues like temperature and light. The mammalian compromise between vulnerability and recovery became one of the great balancing acts of life. Even the human need for long consolidated sleep, 6 to 8 hours of near-total detachment, owes its existence to this period of evolutionary refinement. Our ancestors inherited the deep restorative systems honed in the nocturnal world, even as they eventually returned to daylight. The same chemical signals that lower our temperature and slow our hearts at night were once the tools that kept small Triassic mammals alive in burrows and tree hollows. We are, in a sense, the descendants of creatures who learned to survive by sleeping deeply but carefully. The fossil evidence can only whisper of these changes, but the comparative physiology of modern species tells the story in detail. Mammals today exhibit a unique relationship between metabolism, brain size, and sleep depth. Larger brains correlate with longer, more complex sleep cycles. High metabolic rates demand greater nightly repair. The origin of this relationship almost certainly lies in the nocturnal bottleneck, when small, hot-blooded creatures needed a way to maintain their fragile equilibrium. In that dark world, sleep became not just a state, but a strategy, the physiological twin of warmth itself. It is tempting to think of sleep as a kind of downtime, but for these early mammals it was a matter of life and death. Each night was a bargain between exhaustion and exposure. To rest too lightly meant decay. To rest too deeply meant risk. Evolution's solution was to push the boundaries of both. The mammals that survived were those that could enter profound, energy-saving sleep yet awaken at the faintest threat. That paradox still lives in us, the ability to fall deeply asleep, and yet to startle awake in an instant at a sound in the dark. Every night, as our bodies cool and our minds descend into their silent repairs, we are repeating a very old transaction. It began in the shadows of the Triassic, under the watchful eyes of the dinosaurs. Sleep became the hidden price of warm blood and quick thought. The mammals that mastered this bargain inherited the Earth. A mouse runs a maze under soft red laboratory light. Tiny electrodes hum faintly in its skull, recording the chatter of neurons as it explores. Each corner, each turn, every pause maps onto a unique pattern of firing inside a structure deep in its brain called the hippocampus. The scientists watching know this code by heart. The place cells, neurons that light up as if building an inner map of the world. But what fascinates them most is what happens later. When the mouse curls up to sleep, the same cells whisper again in the same order, faster, quieter, like a dream repeating itself in miniature. The maze is gone, yet the memory replays, as if the brain is editing the day's footage before storing it away for good. This phenomenon, first noticed in rodent studies in the late 20th century, changed how scientists thought about sleep. It revealed that while the body lies motionless, the brain is anything but idle. Sleep became not a blank stretch between waking hours, but a critical phase in which the brain rearranges, reinforces, and refines experience. In mammals, especially those with complex behaviour and large neocortices, the architecture of sleep, alternating between slow, synchronised waves and bursts of rapid eye movement, acts like a two-part conversation between regions of the brain. Information collected by the hippocampus, the short-term storage site, is gradually replayed and transferred to the cortex, the long-term archive. When early mammals evolved deep sleep phases during the Paleogene, after the fall of the dinosaurs, they were also refining the neurological machinery that made memory possible. Their expanding brains demanded systems to avoid saturation. Sleep became the time when clutter could be cleared and what mattered could be preserved. Fossil endocasts from that period show the gradual inflation of neocortical areas, especially in early primates and small insectivores. This expansion came at a metabolic cost, but sleep offered the maintenance needed to justify it. Even then, it wasn't rest for rest's sake. It was investment, storing experience to build smarter behaviour the next day. When modern researchers observe a rat sleeping after a maze trial, they can trace these memory transfers almost like watching a data upload. The hippocampal neurons fire in brief rhythmic bursts known as sharp wave ripples. These ripples coincide with patterns in the neocortex that suggest information is being written into long-term storage. In slow-wave sleep, these oscillations are orderly and synchronized, allowing efficient transfer. It is as if the brain compresses the day's experiences, sorting what to keep and what to discard. Later, during rapid eye movement sleep, the same information seems to be reactivated but in a freer, less structured form, possibly integrating it with older memories or testing it against imagined scenarios. We might say that slow-wave sleep saves the files and REM sleep reads them back in strange combinations. The result is both stability and creativity, reliable recall mixed with new associations. When a mouse or a human wakes, it carries not only a cleaner archive but also a subtly reorganized perspective on the world. The memory of the maze is intact, but the potential solutions to the next one have multiplied. Neuroscientists sometimes describe sleep as an offline state of the brain, a time when external input is minimized and internal computation dominates. This analogy fits remarkably well with what experiments show. During wakefulness, sensory information floods the cortex, and neurons compete for attention. During sleep, that traffic quiets. The hippocampus then has exclusive bandwidth to replay stored sequences without interference. In effect, the brain disconnects from the outside world to better understand it. This pattern appears across species. Birds replay song patterns during rest. Marine mammals consolidate navigation routes. Even reptiles show rudimentary alternations between active and quiet brain states that may represent ancestral versions of this process. The link between sleep and memory may have been strengthened as mammals developed longer periods of immobility and higher cognitive demands. For small Paleogene mammals navigating new forests, the ability to remember food locations, predator routes, and social cues was crucial. Sleep's memory function would have been a powerful evolutionary advantage. Those whose brains could stabilize and reorganize memories more efficiently could adapt faster to changing environments. Over millions of years, that advantage shaped both physiology and behavior. Modern imaging confirms that during deep sleep, metabolic activity in the hippocampus drops while the neocortex briefly spikes. This suggests that information is being transferred out of the hippocampus, like files move from temporary storage to permanent archives. In parallel, certain genes linked to synaptic growth are activated only during sleep. Dendrites, the branching ends of neurons, change shape, pruning weak connections and strengthening those that survived the day's competition. Sleep is therefore not a passive process, but a physical restructuring of the brain's wiring. What we call rest is actually the brain's construction shift, building the architecture of memory. In humans, this nightly process shapes everything from language learning to emotional balance. Studies show that after sleep, people remember facts better, perform complex motor tasks more smoothly, and are less reactive to emotional stimuli. The same patterns seen in rodents replay in our own heads, scaled up to billions of neurons. The hippocampus reactivates the day's patterns, faces, words, routes, and sends them outward to the cortex where long-term representations live. If deprived of sleep, the system falters. New memories remain fragile, and old ones become harder to retrieve. The next day's learning is poorer because yesterday's experience never made it into the archive. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes sense. A creature that learns from experience but cannot preserve those lessons gains little. Sleep, by enabling durable learning without constant waking rehearsal, made intelligence efficient. It allowed mammals to carry yesterday's information into tomorrow's decisions. That may explain why species with complex social behavior or environmental challenges, like primates and elephants, spend significant portions of their lives asleep despite the risks. The cost of unconsciousness is outweighed by the benefits of refined memory. Some researchers argue that the alternation between slow-wave and REM sleep reflects not just physiological needs but two modes of cognition, one that stabilizes, another that experiments. Slow-wave sleep cements what is already known. REM sleep explores variations, connecting memories that share emotional or contextual themes. This might be the root of what we later call creativity, the ability to link disparate experiences into something new. If so, the first mammals that slept deeply may have also been the first to imagine indirectly, to combine sensations in ways not encountered in life. In the lab, the beauty of this system is visible in its rhythm. During slow-wave sleep, the brain's electrical activity slows to less than 1 cycle per second. In REM sleep, it speeds up, resembling wakefulness. The alternation between the two stages forms a repeating pattern through the night. Each cycle lasts about an hour in humans, shorter in smaller mammals. Within these cycles, memory replay and integration occur, sculpting the mental landscape for the next day. The brain is not resting but rehearsing, a silent orchestra tuning itself in darkness. Even now, the fine details remain mysterious. We know that the hippocampus acts as the day's notebook and the cortex as the long-term library. We can observe their dialogue in brain scans, yet the exact language of their exchange, how electrical patterns translate into durable memories, remains unsolved. It is possible that the brain does not replay experiences literally, but rather reconstructs their essence, testing how they might generalize. Perhaps the replay of the mouse's maze or your morning walk is less about remembering the path, and more about predicting the next one. What this suggests is that sleep is the brain's natural simulator, a nightly rehearsal space for possibility. The same circuits that encode experience during the day can recombine those experiences at night, exploring new configurations. When we awake, we carry the results of those experiments, new associations, sharper recognition, a subtle shift in perspective. This may be why problems that seem unsolvable before bed often appear clearer after rest. The brain has quietly run the simulation overnight and returned the optimized pattern. For over 50 million years, from Paleogene forests to modern cities, this system has persisted with little change. Every mammal alive today carries the same neural choreography. Each night, whether a mouse, a whale, or a human, the brain withdraws from the external world to restore order within. The continuity is humbling. Sleep in this view is not an evolutionary afterthought, but one of life's oldest maintenance systems, an elegant solution to the problem of being a thinking animal. And so when you close your eyes and drift away, the stillness is only on the surface. Inside, the ancient dance continues. Neurons replay your day in compressed bursts, synapses shift, circuits strengthen and fade. You're not resting, you're rebuilding. The same process that helped a Paleogene mammal remember the shape of a fruiting branch now helps you recall a name or a face. Sleep is the mind's echo of its own history, proof that the deepest learning happens not through effort, but through surrender. The lights of consciousness flicker out, one neuron at a time. What looks from the outside like stillness is, inside the skull, an immense hydraulic event. As muscles slacken and breathing slows, waves of fluid begin to surge rhythmically through the sleeping brain, slow, deliberate pulses that rise and fall in perfect synchrony with its deepest electrical rhythms. This is the night shift. A hidden network of channels smaller than capillaries begins flushing the brain like a living tide. The cleaning crew of evolution has arrived. For much of the 20th century, scientists saw sleep as the brain's mystery blackout. Necessary, yes, but poorly understood in its physical purpose. We knew it was restorative, that bodies healed, that minds remembered, but the question lingered: what exactly was being repaired? Then, in the early 21st century, imaging techniques finally caught the brain in the act. During deep sleep, cerebrospinal fluid, the clear liquid that bathes the brain and spinal cord, was seen moving in rhythmic pulses through tissue, clearing out metabolic waste that accumulates during wakefulness. The brain, it turned out, had its own nightly plumbing system. The discovery reframed sleep as not merely psychological rest, but biological maintenance. Every waking moment, neurons burn through energy and oxygen at ferocious rates. They release byproducts, beta amyloids, tau proteins, reactive molecules, that, if left to build up, become toxic. Awake brains manage these pollutants slowly, constrained by ongoing thought and sensory processing. But in sleep, the neural traffic stops. Arteries dilate. Interstitial spaces between cells widen by nearly 60%, and fluid rushes in like a tide cleaning a shore. Within hours, concentrations of waste compounds drop sharply. When scientists interrupted deep sleep, the clearance stalled, and those same byproducts began to accumulate. Across mammals, this nightly flushing seems to be a universal principle, though tuned to each species' lifestyle. In smaller animals with faster metabolisms, the cycles are shorter but more frequent. In humans, the process peaks during the deepest, slower stages of non-rapid eye movement sleep, when brain waves synchronize into vast rolling oscillations. Each slow wave corresponds to a coordinated expansion and contraction of blood and cerebrospinal fluid flow, a coupling so precise that the heart and the brain move in rhythm. It is one of nature's quietest choreographies, an internal tide bound to electrical silence. While the glymphatic system, as it is now called, removes molecular waste, another process operates in parallel on a finer scale. synaptic renormalization. During wakefulness, every sensory experience, thought, and learning event strengthens some synapses and weakens others. The brain's connections expand in both number and strength, increasing energy demand. Sleep is when the balance is restored. Through mechanisms that remain partly mysterious, neurons downscale their connections, pruning unnecessary ones and stabilizing the rest. This not only saves energy, but preserves the brain's flexibility, preventing the network from saturating with noise. It's like trimming branches after a day of growth so the tree can thrive the next morning. In experiments, animals deprived of sleep show swollen synapses and overactive circuits. After recovery sleep, those structures shrink to normal proportions. It is as if the night restores the brain's signal-to-noise ratio, keeping learning efficient and perception sharp. Evolution seems to have tied this synaptic housekeeping tightly to energy economics. Brain tissue is metabolically expensive. Neurons cannot maintain endless growth. Each night they must decide which changes to keep and which to dissolve. The price of wakefulness is growth. The price of sleep is forgetting. At the chemical level, deep sleep is marked by unique metabolic signatures. Adenosine, a molecule that builds up with activity and signals fatigue, is gradually cleared. Glucose utilization shifts from immediate energy to repair and replenishment. Growth hormone surges, fueling protein synthesis and tissue repair across the body. The immune system rebalances, inflammatory markers drop, while cells responsible for healing increase their activity. In short, the night is when the organism repairs itself at every level, from the DNA within its cells to the macroscopic coordination of its organs. Comparative studies of mammals have shown striking correlations between sleep quality, lifespan, and brain maintenance. Species with long, stable sleep patterns, like primates and elephants, show slower accumulation of neurotoxic proteins across age. Those with fragmented or reduced sleep, like certain herbivores or prey species, show faster neural wear. It suggests that evolution negotiated a trade-off between vigilance and repair. The less time an animal can afford to rest, the faster its neural machinery may decay. In humans, chronic sleep deprivation reveals the same truth. Cognitive decline, memory impairment, metabolic imbalance, and immune dysfunction all trace back to nights when the cleaners never came. Even the blood-brain barrier, that protective filter between the brain and bloodstream, becomes more permeable with poor sleep, allowing inflammatory molecules to leak inward. The result is subtle but cumulative damage. Over weeks or months, the uncleaned brain begins to mimic aging. Over years, the risks compound into disease. Modern neuroscience now suspects that the very disorders once thought to be purely genetic or degenerative, like Alzheimer's, may in part be accelerated by failures of nightly clearance. The brain, simply put, chokes on yesterday's work. The link between sleep and metabolism extends far beyond the head. The body's organs follow the same circadian rhythms. The liver switches from processing nutrients to recycling damaged proteins. The kidneys regulate fluid balance differently, anticipating a period of rest rather than intake. The endocrine system calibrates hormones that control appetite, repair, and immunity. It's a planetary scale coordination inside one organism, all orchestrated by darkness. Wakefulness is production, sleep is maintenance. Break that rhythm, and entropy wins. Interestingly, some of the earliest hints of these processes appeared not in humans, but in rodents. When researchers deprived rats of sleep entirely, the results were dramatic. Within weeks, the animals developed skin lesions, lost the ability to regulate body temperature, and eventually died, not of starvation, but of metabolic collapse. Their bodies could not maintain internal order without nightly restoration. Later studies showed similar effects in humans: disrupted glucose metabolism, increased stress hormones, weakened immunity. The line between mind and body, between fatigue and disease, grew thinner. From an evolutionary perspective, this deep link between sleep and repair likely emerged in the Cenozoic, when mammals diversified into complex ecologies demanding both high intelligence and endurance. Their warm-blooded metabolism produced immense oxidative stress, molecular damage caused by reactive oxygen species generated during energy use. Sleep became the countermeasure, allowing antioxidant systems to reset. The more active the brain, the more crucial the downtime. It was not indulgence, it was engineering. The paradox remains elegant. Consciousness itself, that bright flare of thought, creates the waste that only unconsciousness can remove. Each waking moment, neurons build up microscopic debt, paid only in sleep. The deeper the sleep, the more complete the repayment. It's a design that favours balance over excess, a system that rewards periodic surrender rather than endless striving. In this way, sleep is both vulnerability and resilience, to lie still in darkness so that every cell may rise clean in the morning. Today, scientists measure the pulse of these night cleaners in humans using advanced imaging. They watch cerebrospinal fluid wash through the ventricles like slow tides, its rhythm perfectly matched to the brain's electrical waves. They track chemical markers before and after sleep and see toxins decline. They measure synaptic proteins and find them reset. Even dreams, those vivid remnants of interactivity, may ride on this tide, a byproduct of a brain rewiring and rinsing itself at once. We do not simply rest, we regenerate. There is something profoundly humbling in that realization. For all our technology, we still rely on this ancient nightly cleansing, a process shared with shrews, whales, and even the quiet bats folded into the roofs of caves. We sleep for the same reason our earliest mammalian ancestors did, to keep the machinery of thought from poisoning itself. No amount of caffeine or willpower can replace that. Sleep is not a choice. It is the oldest form of self-preservation. And so, every night, as you drift into that first slow descent, the custodians awaken, the silent tides of fluid, the enzymes that mend, the circuits that prune. They will work without applause or memory, rebuilding the mind from within. When you wake, the evidence of their labour will be invisible, yet every thought, every movement, every clear moment of consciousness will owe them its existence. Imagine this, the Miocene forest at dusk, an ocean of green canopies rolling into gold light. The heat of the day dissolves into a chorus of cicadas and the distant glide of fruit bats. Shadows gather in the crowns of fig trees, and somewhere between the branches the first primates of the evening begin to quiet. A few cling to trunks, some groom lazily, and others watch the horizon, waiting for the last hawks to vanish. Then, almost imperceptibly, they shift together. One by one, bodies tuck in, hands curl around bark, eyes half close. Above the forest floor, a dozen small silhouettes sink into the same rhythm. For the first time in Earth's history, sleep has become social. By the Middle Miocene, around 15 million years ago, the world had transformed into a greenhouse of green corridors. The continents were still colliding into their modern shapes, creating lush belts of tropical and subtropical forest from Africa to Southeast Asia. Primates, already millions of years into their arboreal experiment, thrived here. Their ancestors had long escaped the ground's predators by living in trees, but the canopy was not without peril. It was a labyrinth of branches, fragile supports, and nightly hunters, serpents, owls, and cats that could climb as well as leap. In such a world, sleep could not be an individual act of surrender. It became a collective strategy. Fossil evidence and modern primate behaviour both suggest that group sleeping evolved not as comfort but as defence. A lone primate in the canopy is easy prey, but a dozen together form an early warning network. Eyes catch movement, ears share alarms. One animal's disturbance ripples through the others in seconds. The cost is that nobody sleeps as deeply as they might alone. The benefit is that everyone wakes in time to survive. This balance between vigilance and restoration became the blueprint for social rest. In these Miocene forests, primates refined the art of sleeping above danger. Branch diameter mattered. A limb too narrow meant instability, too wide, and predators could join. Many small monkeys developed special postures, thighs locked against branches, tails curled as counterweights, fingers flexed in partial grip even in sleep. Some hung beneath horizontal branches, clinging like shadows. Others pressed their bodies against the trunk, using friction and muscle memory to hold position. These were not yet the engineered nests of later apes, but they were architecture all the same. Biological structures built out of anatomy and behaviour. Arboreal sleep forced a new kind of trust. To doze while suspended 10 metres above the forest floor required faith in both one's own body and the bodies nearby. Group sleeping thus became an invisible web of social coordination. If one stirred, the others adjusted. If one sensed motion in the leaves below, others awoke almost instantly. The phenomenon that scientists today call alarm contagion likely emerged in these early tree dwellers. A single rustle could cascade into a wave of semi-wakefulness across the group. Each individual experienced fragmented but collectively synchronized rest. Studies of modern primates give us a glimpse into how this worked. Species such as colobus monkeys, langurs, and howler monkeys, all inheritors of the ancient arboreal lifestyle, show sleep patterns punctuated by short, shared awakenings. When one individual becomes alert, perhaps at a distant sound, nearby group members' EEG patterns show similar arousals within seconds. It is a biological chorus of light and shade, alternating states of vigilance that together maintain safety without total sleeplessness. The transition to group sleep may have shaped more than survival. It may have seeded the roots of empathy. To remain attuned to others even while partially unconscious requires a deep interlinking of attention and emotion. The same neural systems that coordinate social bonding, the limbic circuits for recognition, fear and reassurance, would have been active during these shared nights. To sleep near another was to trust them with your most defenceless hours. Over time, that trust could evolve into cooperation beyond the canopy. The rhythms of light also sculpted this behaviour. In equatorial forests, day and night divide almost perfectly, creating predictable windows of darkness. Primates learned to use the fading of light not only as a cue for rest, but as a communal clock. Dusk became the signal to cluster, dawn the signal to disperse. Even today, species like macaques and verveters display group sleep entries, where individuals descend or ascend together in synchrony, as if choreographed by the forest itself. These ancient schedules trained brains to measure time collectively. Sleep in this sense was the first social calendar. From an evolutionary standpoint, the Miocene was a crucible of sensory refinement. Vision became the dominant sense. Forward-facing eyes, overlapping fields of view, and colour perception all improved the ability to navigate the canopy, but they also made light itself central to the primate's biology. Melatonin rhythms synced to the sun's descent. Cortisol levels rose with morning brightness. The forest's dappled contrast, patches of shadow and radiance, became a natural metronome, teaching bodies when to slow down and when to wake. The alternation of light and shade, once a cosmic fact, became an internal rhythm of the mind. Predation pressure moulded behaviour further. Fossil traces and comparative anatomy suggest that some Miocene cats, like the ancestral lineages of leopards, were already stealth climbers. In response, smaller primates likely developed group vigilance behaviours that mirrored those of modern monkeys. Sentinels taking turns to remain half awake, heads twitching toward distant sounds, even soft contact calls exchanged through the night. These calls were probably low and short, meant not to alert predators but to confirm presence. Tiny vocal reassurances that all was well. The forest at night might have been filled with such faint murmurs, a chorus of breathing and pulse-level communication. Social sleep also intersected with thermoregulation. In dense canopies, temperature can drop sharply before dawn. By huddling, primates conserved heat, a behaviour still seen in modern lorises and tamarins. In the tropics, the opposite strategy evolved, spacing apart to dissipate body warmth while maintaining visual proximity. This dynamic, alternating closeness and distance through the night, added yet another layer of complexity to their social fabric. Sleep was no longer just personal recovery, it was communal engineering. The fossil record, silent on softer behaviour, still hints at this shift. The limb proportions of Miocene primates, grasping feet, opposable thumbs, flexible spines, tell a story of animals designed for positional precision. These traits didn't just enable feeding or climbing, they allowed stable rest. Even eye orbit size can offer clues. Larger orbits suggest increased nocturnal activity or sensitivity to low light, both of which correlate with evolved sleep vigilance. By cross-referencing anatomy with modern behaviour, scientists can reconstruct the ecological pressures that sculpted the first communal slumbers. In this period, sleep and safety became intertwined with cognition. A primate who could remember which branches were stable, which routes led to secure resting sites, had an advantage. Over generations, memory and spatial awareness co-evolved with social bonding and vigilance. The canopy became a cognitive gymnasium, and sleep its nightly intermission, a time when the brain rehearsed the geography of safety. The habits of these tree dwellers would echo into the future, shaping the psychology of species that would eventually descend to the ground. Imagine now that same forest just before dawn. The group begins to stir. One yawns. Another shakes dew from its fur. The eastern sky glows pale behind a curtain of leaves. For a brief moment, the troop moves in unison. Not a deliberate march, but a shared awakening. This coordination, born of necessity, is the beginning of something larger. The rhythm of sleeping and waking together would later underpin migration, parenting, and even ritual. Long before humans built villages or lit fires, our lineage learned to time its nights to one another. What began as survival became culture in slow motion. The architecture of communal rest, bodies aligned in branches, breaths synchronized, was the first infrastructure of trust. It may even have influenced how primate societies handled conflict and cohesion. Groups that could maintain harmony through the vulnerability of sleep likely managed tension better when awake. The night became an unspoken contract. I will not harm you while you cannot defend yourself. From that contract came the earliest shadows of morality. The Miocene forests eventually thinned as climates cooled, but their lessons persisted. When later apes began crafting temporary beds and eventually sleeping on the ground, they carried these rhythms with them. The instinct to cluster at night, to stir when another stirs, to seek safety in company. These were gifts from a time when the dark belonged to predators, and survival depended on proximity. Sleep had evolved from a solitary retreat into a social covenant, and if you listen closely, that covenant still echoes. In modern primates, even in humans, our sleep remains synchronized with those around us. Partners stir at the same hour, families align their rhythms, whole communities rise and rest with shared light. The forest is gone, but the choreography remains, a relic of the Miocene canopy, when eyes closed and hearts kept watch together in the moving twilight of trees. A clearing under a Paleolithic sky, its stars mirrored in the eyes of a dozen early humans. The wind smells of ash and resin. At the centre of the circle, a small fire murmurs, its glow licking the edges of the dark. Around it lie bodies, curled and stretched, the slow rhythm of breathing blending with the crackle of embers. Somewhere beyond the light, eyes glint back. predators watching but keeping distance. The line between survival and surrender has shifted. For the first time, our ancestors sleep on the ground. This moment, perhaps unfolding 800,000 years ago, marked one of the most profound changes in the biology of rest. Fire was more than warmth or light. It was permission. Permission to descend from the trees, to stretch out flat on the soil, and to let go of a vigilance that had defined primate nights for tens of millions of years. Before this, sleep in the open was suicide. Leopards, hyenas, saber-toothed cats, all owned the night. But with fire, the hierarchy of fear began to blur. Its light repelled, its smoke confused, its heat protected. For the first time, humans carved a zone of safety from darkness itself. Archaeological evidence places this transition somewhere between the early and middle Pleistocene. Sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, dated to nearly 1 million years ago, hold microscopic traces of burned plant ash and bone that show not wildfire but sustained, controlled combustion. Homo erectus, tall and long-limbed, had learned to feed and tend flame. The implications extend beyond cooking or warmth. They touch the architecture of consciousness. To control fire was to control night, and therefore to change the very pattern of sleep. The canopy no longer constrained the body's shape. Freed from branches, early humans could sprawl, curl, or cluster directly on the earth. Muscles could finally relax fully, no longer tense to cling or balance. This alone may have deepened rest cycles, allowing longer stretches of immobility and more consolidated sleep phases. Longer bouts meant not just more recovery, but also more time for the brain's memory systems to replay and reorganize experience. The fire's stability allowed the nervous system to slow in ways impossible in the shifting branches of trees. Heat regulation became another hidden benefit. Nights on open ground can swing from sweltering to freezing, but fire's steady warmth buffered those extremes. In Paleolithic camps, glowing coals would have reduced the need for constant huddling, letting groups spread out slightly, yet remain within a shared zone of security. Smoke deterred insects, reducing the disturbances that had once fragmented rest in forest canopies. Bit by bit, fire turned night from a period of threat into one of restoration. The social dimension was equally transformative. Firelight extended the day, creating an intermediate time between labour and sleep, an evolutionary invention of evening. Before fire, darkness ended activity abruptly. After it, night became negotiable. Within that new margin of time, communication expanded. Faces were visible in flicker and shadow. Gesture, laughter, and the cadence of vocal rhythm could evolve under the forgiving filter of half-light. This is perhaps where storytelling began, not as entertainment, but as a side effect of safety, when the mind finally had room to wander aloud. Fire also redefined vigilance itself. Not everyone had to stay awake at once. In many traditional species, defense depends on overlapping alertness. With fire, that load could be shared differently. Some individuals tended flames or kept peripheral watch while others slept. Over evolutionary time, this division may have reduced the need for constant micro-arousals, encouraging deeper stages of slow-wave rest. The brain, always responsive to environmental stability, began trusting its surroundings more completely. The night became a shared contract between consciousness and flame. To lie on the ground also brought new sensory experiences. The smell of soil, the hum of nocturnal insects, the vibration of distant movement, all became part of the nightly rhythm. Such grounding may have reinforced spatial memory, linking the body to fixed landmarks instead of the shifting canopy. Archaeologists have found repeated patterns of occupation at open-air hearth sites, suggesting that groups return to the same sleeping grounds across seasons. Memory now had geography. Each night's rest reinforced familiarity with the terrain, mapping safety into the landscape itself. Yet fire was not a perfect shield. There were times when it failed, when embers died and predators closed in. The evidence of burned bones mingled with gnawed ones reminds us that fire was a fragile ally. Maintaining it required vigilance and skill, a continual loop of learning that likely shaped both cooperation and cognition. Those who understood fire's needs survived. Those who neglected it vanished. Sleep, therefore, became tied to discipline. The rhythm of tending embers and resting near them demanded social coordination. Perhaps the earliest watches, the first rotation of night sentinels, originated here, around these flickering circles of trust. Scientists studying sleep architecture suggest that the changes initiated by fire may have had neurological consequences. Longer, safer nights could support an increase in slow-wave sleep, the phase associated with physical restoration, and rapid eye movement sleep, tied to creativity and emotional processing. These deeper cycles, repeated over generations, might have fueled the expansion of symbolic thought. When the environment allowed bodies to relax, minds found time to drift, constructing internal simulations, rehearsing future scenarios, inventing meaning. Sleep, once a biological necessity, became a cognitive catalyst. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. Fossil cranial capacity in Homo erectus already shows significant expansion, and brain energy demands rise steeply with size. Without efficient recovery, such neural growth would be unsustainable. Fire, by protecting rest, could have indirectly enabled that enlargement. A bigger brain, in turn, reinforced control of fire, a feedback loop between cognition and comfort. What began as an accident of lightning became a partnership between mind and element. The visual dominance of humans also has roots here. Firelight allowed for social interaction after dark in ways no other primate experienced. Those flickering shadows sculpted new pathways in the visual cortex, teaching the brain to read subtle movements and expressions in low light. This nocturnal rehearsal of empathy, the ability to infer mood or intent by glow alone, may have been one of the earliest forms of social intelligence. Around the fire, attention was no longer scattered by daylight tasks. The group could finally look inward, literally and metaphorically. It's tempting to imagine these nights as calm, but they were likely restless symphonies of small sounds, the crackle of sap, the shifting of bodies, the soft clicks of embers. Such sensory constancy may have trained the brain to tolerate rhythmic noise without waking fully, a trait that still defines human sleep today. We rest not in silence, but in a patterned soundscape. The modern preference for the hum of fans or rain echoes these ancient acoustics. The comfort of knowing the world is stable, the fire still burns. Firelight also reshaped circadian rhythm. Before artificial light, melatonin, the hormone that cues sleep, rose sharply with darkness. Fire's glow delayed its onset slightly, stretching wakefulness by an hour or two. Over evolutionary timescales, this gentle extension may have synchronized human rest differently from that of other primates, who still retreat immediately at dusk. The human night became longer, its waking portion quieter and more contemplative. That gap between work and sleep remains in us, the time we now fill with reading, music, or thought. It began when fire taught us to linger. Even today, anthropologists studying the few remaining pre-industrial societies note how fire mediates sleep. People cluster near it in varying distances, some close for warmth, others farther for comfort. Sleep becomes communal but not uniform, a spectrum of wakefulness bound by light. Such patterns, likely mirrored in early Homo erectus groups, ensured both safety and social bonding. The campfire was the nucleus of community, where cooperation replaced isolation, and where vulnerability became collective rather than individual. When dawn returned, ash marked the outline of another successful night. Each morning reaffirmed the experiment. Ground sleep had worked again. Over generations, this confidence transformed physiology. Our limbs adapted for walking, not climbing. Our spine aligned with upright posture. Our hands, once for grasping branches, became free to carry embers. The arboreal body of our ancestors slowly became terrestrial, shaped by nights spent beside controlled flame. Evolution had accepted the wager. That light could hold back darkness long enough for a mind to dream safely. A cave floor, layered not with random debris, but with intention. Beneath the faint smell of ancient smoke lies a carpet of grass and crushed leaves, pressed flat by bodies that once slept there. When archaeologists uncover it hundreds of thousands of years later, they can still see the imprint of those nights, the pattern of bedding replaced and renewed, the chemistry of ash mixed deliberately into the fibres. It is not just evidence of habitation, it is evidence of comfort. By the late Middle Pleistocene, perhaps 200,000 years ago, our ancestors were no longer merely surviving the night, they were designing it. Excavations at sites such as Border Cave in South Africa and Sibudu, just to the north, reveal the first known beds, compacted layers of sedges, grasses and aromatic plants arranged on top of burned ash. These were not crude piles of vegetation, but carefully chosen materials refreshed over time. Each layer tells a story of cognition, of planning, of understanding cause and effect. To make a bed is to anticipate rest before it happens. It means thinking beyond the present discomfort into the idea of tomorrow. Ash, in particular, reveals remarkable insight. When burned plant matter cools, it repels insects and parasites. By spreading ash beneath fresh vegetation, early humans built chemical barriers against mosquitoes, lice, and ticks. The practice shows up repeatedly in stratified layers, suggesting not accident but continuity, a cultural habit passed from one generation to the next. The combination of grass for softness and ash for hygiene turned sleeping from a passive act into a form of engineering. Such behaviour marks a cognitive threshold. Building a bed requires not only materials but sequence, clearing the surface, layering ash, arranging plants, and maintaining them. Archaeologists at Sibudu found multiple phases of renewal, each separated by thin sediments. This means the inhabitants returned to the same sleeping spots repeatedly, rebuilding when bedding decomposed or became infested. They weren't just finding shelter, they were maintaining one. That rhythm of care, cleaning, replacing, improving, suggests a growing sense of ownership of space. The night had become a domain that could be managed. Physiologically, this shift mattered. Elevated, insulated bedding protected against moisture and temperature loss. Two major threats in open caves or rock shelters. Experiments replicating such plant mats show they can reduce conductive heat loss by up to 30% compared to bare earth. For early humans with limited body fat and no woven fabrics, such thermal stability could mean the difference between shallow, interrupted rest and deep, restorative sleep. A warmer, bite-free night allowed the body to commit more energy to repair, digestion, and immune function. Sleep itself could finally unfold in longer, unbroken stretches, an invisible revolution in biology triggered by a simple pile of grass. The act of building also reveals the rise of memory and foresight. Those who collected sedges had to know which plants resisted decay or insects and where to find them. Many of the species identified in ancient bedding layers, such as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐏𝐒, rich in aromatic compounds, still repel pests today. This suggests observational learning passed down through social knowledge. Someone must have noticed that certain leaves smelled sharp and that fewer bites followed. Over generations, such practical discoveries accumulated into an early science of the night, a kind of ecological wisdom woven into the culture of rest. If fire redefined where we could sleep, bedding redefined how. The comfort of softness and insulation likely altered posture and muscle tone during rest. Unlike arboreal primates, who cling or curl, these ground sleepers could sprawl fully, supporting the spine on even surfaces. This position allowed more complete muscle relaxation and possibly deeper slow-wave sleep. The shift may have influenced anatomy subtly. Longer spines, heavier limbs, skeletal adaptations for lying flat. Evolution, responding to comfort, reinforced it. There is also evidence of spatial organization within sleeping areas. At several sites, bedding overlaps with hearths but never directly touches them, implying intentional placement for warmth without risk. Peripheral zones show signs of tool maintenance and food remains, suggesting that rest, work, and socialization were spatially divided. In that pattern lies the earliest blueprint of architecture. The modern distinction between bedroom and living area begins here, in layers of ash and plant fibre. Ash layers also served another unexpected purpose: sanitation. When bedding decayed, early humans burned the remains, leaving a sterile foundation for new mats. This practice not only cleaned the site, but also recycled materials, producing fresh insect-repelling ash. The repetition of burning and rebuilding, documented through microscopic phytoliths and charcoal residues, shows that these people were not only living with fire, they were thinking through it. Fire became both tool and cleanser, the night's engineer and its physician. The significance of such practices stretches beyond comfort. The very notion of bed suggests that sleep was now something anticipated and prepared for, rather than stumbled into from exhaustion. That mental shift, from reacting to planning, represents the foundation of abstract thought. To plan for rest is to project into the future. It means the concept of later has entered the human mind. Archaeologists also see hints of social organisation in these sites. Bedding areas often cluster, implying communal rest but with some degree of spacing, perhaps between families or individuals. That balance between proximity and privacy may have roots here. Lying down together required cooperation, tolerance of others' movements, trust in shared safety, and synchronization of routines. A group that could sleep peacefully together was likely one that could coordinate by day. The architecture of sleep mirrored the architecture of society. The botanical record deepens this picture. Many bedding layers include not just utilitarian grasses, but fragrant herbs and leaves from trees with medicinal properties. Whether chosen for comfort, smell, or healing, their presence suggests sensory awareness, an understanding that aroma and well-being were linked. The same olfactory preferences that guided bedding choice may later have shaped ritual and cuisine. The earliest sense of comfort in that sense were already part of the human night. These innovations didn't occur everywhere at once. Different regions experimented with different strategies, some relying more on sand layers, others on reeds or leaves, but all show a convergence toward controlled, repeatable sleep environments. This universality hints at selection pressure. Groups that slept better survived better. Reduced disease transmission, improved recovery, and sharper cognition would accumulate generational advantages. Over time, those who mastered the night reshaped the species itself. Today, when archaeologists sift through those compressed plant fibers, they are reading more than traces of vegetation. They are reading an early form of design thinking. Each layer is a sentence in a dialogue between mind and material. The ash barrier speaks of chemistry, the plant choice of ecology, the spatial pattern of cooperation. Together they reveal a creature learning not just to inhabit environments, but to modify them consciously. The bed becomes a statement of identity, the first artifact that says, "I will rest here and I will return." From a physiological angle, these stable resting sites likely enhanced sleep consistency, which is critical for hormonal regulation. Predictable timing and comfort could stabilize circadian rhythms, reinforcing daytime alertness and nighttime restoration. Over generations, such regularity might have supported the expansion of higher cognitive functions that depend on memory integration during sleep. The roots of human intelligence in this light are not only in tools or language, but in the design of where and how we lay our heads. What remains so moving about these discoveries is their ordinariness. There are no grand monuments here, no carved idols or weapons, just flattened mats of grass replaced again and again by unseen hands. Yet within their layers lies the architecture of civilization in embryo. The first walls were not built to divide day from night. They were beds, built to soften the earth, to keep insects at bay, to cradle the brain that would one day imagine walls at all. If one stands today in those caves, silent, cool, dust motes drifting through narrow beams of light, it is easy to feel that the people who slept here are not truly gone. The instinct to arrange our sleep space, to make it slightly more comfortable, slightly more ours, still binds us to them. Every modern bed, no matter how elaborate, is an echo of that first deliberate act of rest, layering grass over ash, shaping darkness into safety, and perhaps, in that moment of lying down after the fire has dimmed, when the air smells faintly of smoke and earth, the mind still rehearses a memory older than history, the memory of the first humans who dared to make the night their own. Imagine this, a cave floor, layered like a memory. Beneath the surface, dust lies a story told in grass stems, ashes and faint chemical traces, marks of nights spent by people who thought carefully about where and how they would sleep. The layers are thin but deliberate, one pressed over another by bodies that returned again and again to the same place. It is easy to imagine them lying there, the air still warm from the fire, the smell of crushed leaves rising as they shifted. What remains today is only the imprint of that intention, the first designed night. By the late Middle Pleistocene, roughly 200,000 years ago, humans were no longer improvising rest. They were crafting it. In southern Africa, at sites like Sibudu and Border Cave, archaeologists have uncovered bedding layers built with precision. These weren't random piles of vegetation swept aside for convenience. They were assembled purposefully. Thick mats of sedges and grasses spread atop cooled ash, refreshed periodically, and sometimes burned at the end of their use to start anew. Each act required planning, memory, and an understanding of cause and effect. These were not the instincts of a creature simply collapsing from fatigue, but of one anticipating tomorrow's comfort. The science of these beds reads almost like a field guide to intelligence. Beneath the microscope, the crushed leaves and plant fibres tell a complex story. Some species were chosen for their structure, tough stems that resisted decay and formed springy mats. Others carried aromatic oils, the same compounds that modern botanists know repel insects and parasites. Early humans seem to have recognized this by observation, perhaps noticing that certain leaves reduced itching, or that sleep was deeper where the air smelled sharp. When those plants appear in layer after layer across years, it becomes clear that this was not luck. It was knowledge, passed through generations, an inherited familiarity with the chemistry of comfort. The ash beneath was just as deliberate. Ash does more than signal old fires. It is sterile, dry, and insect-repelling. By spreading it under fresh bedding, our ancestors created a barrier that discouraged crawling pests and slowed bacterial growth. Experiments with modern analogues show that such layers reduce both biting insects and moisture retention. These ancient people, without language as we know it, had discovered practical sanitation. The foundation of every clean home in human history, an understanding that ash purifies, was born in the place we now call the bedroom. At Sibudu, archaeologists found multiple cycles of construction, each about the thickness of a palm. Some were burned intentionally before new bedding was added. Burning the old layers sterilized the surface, killed lingering parasites, and produced fresh ash for the next foundation. In this rhythm of laying, burning, and relaying, one sees the early outlines of maintenance, even ritual. Night was no longer an external event. It was something prepared for. The day ended not in exhaustion, but in design. The environmental context reinforces just how meaningful this innovation was. The Middle Pleistocene climate oscillated between cooler dry spells and warm humid intervals, bringing mosquitoes, ticks, and temperature swings. Sleeping directly on bare earth in such conditions would mean dampness, bites, and constant waking. But these layered beds provided insulation from cold and moisture. Analyses of plant structures suggest that the mats could reach several centimetres thick, soft enough to cushion bone and muscle against the uneven rock. The ability to lie fully stretched, supported and warm may have increased the proportion of deep sleep stages each night. If so, this invention didn't just change comfort, it changed cognition. More consolidated sleep meant better memory, stronger learning and sharper daytime performance. There is something quietly revolutionary in that. Fire may have allowed humans to claim the night, but bedding allowed them to rest deeply within it. It bridged the gap between biology and technology, between what the body needed and what the mind could imagine. The act of gathering and arranging plants required foresight and cooperation. It turned sleep into a communal project. Someone had to collect the sedges, someone to clear the floor, someone to spread the ash. It is easy to picture conversation, gestures, laughter, shared knowledge of which plants worked best. In that nightly ritual, social bonds were reinforced. Comfort, in a very literal sense, became culture. The choice of materials also shows regional awareness. The grasses at Sibudu differ from those at Border Cave, reflecting local ecologies. In both cases, the builders understood their landscapes intimately. They knew which reeds grew in shaded wetlands, which leaves held aromatic oils, which burned cleanly into ash. This depth of ecological literacy hints at the roots of environmental intelligence that still shapes our species. The same minds that built these beds would, millennia later, build tools, houses and medicine, all born from this habit of noticing what nature offered at night. The physical evidence paints a picture not of chaos, but of order. In these sites, bedding layers often cluster in consistent zones, with hearths nearby but never overlapping. Fire for warmth, bedding for rest, tools for use, all arranged with spatial logic. The coordination of space within a shelter implies mental mapping, the ability to remember where things belong. It also suggests that rest was not merely recovery, but part of a daily rhythm, intertwined with work and maintenance. Some areas of these caves even show wear patterns consistent with long-term occupation. These weren't fleeting camps, but home bases, the first rooms on Earth. Modern science adds another layer to this story through experiments with reconstructed plant beds. Researchers building replicas using the same materials found that aromatic plants like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐏𝐒 released natural insect repellents when crushed or warmed. When placed over ash, they stay drier and last longer than raw grass. The scent alone can reduce mosquito activity. In essence, these prehistoric humans engineered their own form of pest control without chemicals or nets. Every leaf placed beneath them represented a small victory over the natural world's discomforts. One of the most profound implications of these discoveries is psychological. To prepare a place of rest is to acknowledge vulnerability and to control it. Animals sleep wherever exhaustion overtakes them, but humans began to choose. The invention of bedding marks the birth of intentional rest, a distinction between lying down because one must and lying down because one can. In that choice lies the seed of civilization. The desire for a better night's sleep led directly to a new kind of mind, one that plans, remembers and values comfort not as luxury but as necessity. The benefits extended far beyond the night itself. Better sleep likely improved immune function, thermoregulation, and emotional stability. A well-rested group could cooperate more effectively, handle conflict with less aggression, and endure environmental stress with sharper judgment. Over evolutionary time, this feedback loop between physical comfort and mental capacity may have amplified the very qualities that define humanity: reason, patience, empathy. We became a species of designers because we learned first to design our rest. It's worth pausing to imagine what such a night might have looked like. The air thick with the scent of crushed leaves, the faint warmth of a fading fire, children breathing softly on their grass mats, adults stirring only when the embers hissed. Outside, the wind carried the distant calls of predators, but inside the cave there was calm. Perhaps a few individuals stayed half awake, adding a log, adjusting a mat, ensuring that no one rolled into the cold stone. These were ordinary gestures, but behind them lay an extraordinary truth. The group understood its environment deeply enough to make the night predictable. The fear of darkness had, for the first time, been tamed through design. The archaeological record shows continuity. Bedding reappears again and again, across sites and epochs, refined but not fundamentally changed. This persistence suggests it worked. No evolutionary adaptation lasts so long unless it delivers a powerful advantage. In the long arc of human prehistory, the plant bed stands as a quiet milestone, less visible than a spear or a painting, but no less transformative. It represents one of the earliest moments when intelligence met tenderness. Perhaps what moves us most is that these beds are still recognizable. Unlike chipped tools or broken bones, they speak a language of familiarity. We know what it feels like to gather soft things before lying down. We know the relief of insulation from the cold ground, the rhythm of shared rest, the comfort of a space that smells faintly of safety. The people who made these beds were not alien ancestors, but versions of us, improvising their way toward a better night. In every sense, they succeeded. The ashened leaves at Cebudu are still there, intact after more than 170,000 years, preserved by the very chemistry their makers understood intuitively. The fire's byproducts protected the bedding from decay, ensuring that their knowledge would outlast their bodies. Through that accident of preservation, they left us a message in cellulose and carbon. That intelligence begins not with invention, but with care. When archaeologists brush away the sediment to expose these layers, they are uncovering the oldest expression of domestic life on record. Before art, before agriculture, before cities, there was this, a deliberate effort to make the night gentle. The material traces of sleep are, in many ways, the first architecture of the human spirit, not built to impress, but to rest. And so, the next time you lie down, beneath sheets instead of leaves, in a home filled with light and heat, remember that the impulse behind it, the instinct to make comfort from chaos, was born in a cave where grass and smoke met. The first bed was both invention and philosophy, a quiet rebellion against nature's indifference. It whispered a thought that would echo through every generation that followed. We can make this place a little better before we close our eyes. A small group of humans asleep beneath the stars, the last embers of the fire pulsing red against the dark. Around them, the savannah breathes, hyenas call in the distance, the wind moves through tall grass, insects hum like static in the air. But not everyone is asleep. One figure sits upright beside the fire, slowly turning a stick in the coals. Another lies half awake, eyes half open, listening. In this fragile hour before dawn, the world is divided not into predators and prey, but into watchers and dreamers. By the late Pleistocene, perhaps 40,000 years ago, humans had spread across continents, from the dry plains of Africa to the icy forests of Europe. They carried fire, tools and memory, but they were still soft animals in a hard world. To sleep deeply was to risk everything. Every rustle in the dark could mean a leopard, a wolf, or another band of humans. Yet they could not remain awake indefinitely. The solution was not to harden the body, but to organize the night. The band itself became a kind of organism, one part always alert while the rest drifted inward. This system, what scientists now call sentinel sleep, still echoes in modern foragers. Observations of groups such as the Hadza in Tanzania show that within any given night, someone is almost always awake. Over a span of 8 hours, the group rarely enters complete silence. One person shifts position, another gets up to add wood to the fire. Someone returns from relieving themselves and sits briefly in the glow before lying back down. Each individual sleeps in overlapping cycles, creating a rolling pattern of vigilance. It is not intentional coordination, but an emergent rhythm, the biology of trust woven with the logic of fear. Human sleep, unlike that of most mammals, is remarkably flexible. We can fall asleep quickly, awaken fully within seconds, and then return to rest. Our species also shows wide variation in what chronobiologists call chronotypes, the natural inclination toward early or late sleep. In ancestral environments, this diversity was not inconvenience but adaptation. The early sleepers and the late risers ensured a full range of coverage through the night. The night was never empty of attention. Even in darkness, the tribe maintained a pulse of awareness. This arrangement required no spoken agreement. It emerged naturally from individual differences in age, health, and temperament. Older members, sleeping lighter and waking more often, became inadvertent guardians. Nursing mothers, whose infants stirred through the night, added another layer of intermittent wakefulness. Adolescents, restless and curious, tended to linger awake after the elders had drifted off. Together, these rhythms overlapped like the beats of a drum circle, one life's interruption seamlessly filling the silence of another. The result was a distributed security system millions of years before technology. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence supports this idea through the structure of forager camps. Sleeping spaces cluster around hearths, with open sightlines toward the surrounding landscape. The fire's smoke repelled insects, its glow delineated safety. Those who stayed awake might repair tools, watch for sparks that could ignite the grass, or simply think. Around that firelight, the foundations of nocturnal culture emerged, whispering, quiet storytelling, humming to children. The night became not a pause in human life, but a slower form of it, lit by vigilance instead of sunlight. The physiology of sentinel sleep is equally revealing. Human brains maintain high sensitivity to auditory stimuli even in deep rest. We wake not from silence, but from pattern deviation, the change in rhythm that signals danger. Studies show that sleepers exposed to familiar ambient sounds remain unbothered, while sudden irregular noises trigger instant arousal. This tuning would have been crucial for survival on open ground. A twig snapping nearby or the distant cough of a predator would activate the lightest sleeper, whose alertness would then ripple through the group. The night was not a period of oblivion, but of listening. The distribution of vigilance also shaped emotion and cooperation. To stay awake while others slept required trust and empathy. The watcher had to understand that their wakefulness served the group, that their patience protected shared vulnerability. This may have reinforced social bonds in subtle ways. Evolution rewards not only the strong but the reliable. The night watcher was the invisible glue of the band, the one whose quiet labour allowed others to dream. Over time, such roles may have gained symbolic meaning. Even today, myths across cultures speak of guardians of the night, sentinels, shamans, constellations that watch the sleeping world. The habit began not in religion but in simple necessity, yet for all its efficiency, sentinel sleep had limits. It relied on the balance between rest and alertness. Too much wakefulness would drain energy, too little, and the band risked predation. What made humans unique was their ability to shift this balance dynamically. If the night seemed peaceful, everyone might drift into deeper rest. If danger loomed, storms, new terrain, the smell of predators, the group's sleep fragmented naturally. The system adapted fluidly to circumstance. In this way, sleep was not a rigid cycle, but an ecosystem behaviour. Fire enhanced the system but did not replace it. Even with flames crackling, danger persisted beyond the circle of light. The fire's scent might mask human odour, but it also attracted curiosity. For the watcher, the fire was both comfort and responsibility. They fed it, adjusted its size, and kept it from dying out. The rhythm of adding wood became a kind of meditation, a task to keep the mind anchored as the body fought drowsiness. The soft pop of resin, the drift of smoke, the faint glow on sleeping faces, these were the tools of reassurance. The Nightwatchers' world was made of sound and light that barely moved. One of the most intriguing modern parallels comes from sleep studies on human flexibility. In controlled environments, when groups sleep together, their cycles spontaneously desynchronize. Someone always wakes, briefly, adjusts position, or checks surroundings. This happens even when danger is absent, suggesting that the behaviour is hardwired. Our nervous systems carry the residue of those ancient responsibilities. The instinct to wake at the creak of a floorboard or to sense movement in the dark is not anxiety. It is inheritance. This pattern of shared vigilance likely influenced other aspects of human life. The rotation of sleep and wake created natural times for reflection. The late-night hours, when only a few were awake, offered rare solitude. The quiet firelight became a cradle for thought, the beginnings of introspection. For those on watch, the mind wandered through memory, fear, and imagination. Perhaps this is where our species' inner voice grew strong, in the silence of keeping guard while others slept. The diversity of chronotypes within the group also encouraged cooperation beyond the night. Morning-oriented individuals were ready to start foraging early. Night-oriented ones were alert for predators returning to dens. The community spanned the entire circadian range, ensuring that someone's body clock was always aligned with the needs of the group. The Nightwatchers, then, were not simply awake. They were the evolutionary compromise between safety and rest. Their variation made humanity resilient. Over generations, this cooperative pattern may have shaped brain development itself. Constant low-level vigilance fostered sensitivity to subtle cues, sound, smell, light, strengthening sensory integration. At the same time, knowing that others were watching allowed deeper rest for those asleep, supporting memory consolidation and learning. It was a mutual exchange. The watchers carried the weight of awareness so that the dreamers could repair and imagine. Together they balanced the ledger of survival. In this way, the human night became layered. Within one camp, different states of consciousness coexisted. One person awake, one half asleep, one dreaming. The boundaries between them were porous, not absolute. In a sense, the community itself never fully slept. This partial wakefulness, like the unihemispheric sleep of dolphins and birds, was our own terrestrial version, distributed across individuals rather than brains. It allowed vulnerability to become safety through cooperation. When dawn finally rose, the watchers would feel the heaviness of fatigue. But theirs was not wasted time. The group's survival, and perhaps its emerging spirituality, depended on their endurance. The transition from night to morning often became a quiet ritual, stirring coals back to life, recounting sounds heard in the dark, sharing fragments of thought. These moments likely built early storytelling traditions. The night's observations, animals passing, stars moving, dreams half remembered, became material for myth. The Nightwatcher's duty evolved into narration, turning vigilance into meaning. In modern times, remnants of this pattern persist in our biology. Some people still find clarity in late hours, while others wake before dawn with ease. We call it insomnia or morningness, but it may simply be our ancient ecology replaying itself. The Nightwatchers have not disappeared. They have just moved indoors. the human species continues to divide its attention across time, ensuring that someone is always half awake somewhere, carrying the memory of the fire. It's easy to romanticize this image, but it also speaks to something deeper in our nature. We are communal even in rest. No one sleeps entirely alone in evolutionary terms. Our nervous systems were forged in the presence of others' breathing, others' murmurs, the steady pulse of shared life. The silence we seek today, dark rooms, isolation, locked doors, is a recent invention. For most of our history, safety was not in solitude, but in company. The sound of another turning beside you, the faint glow of fire on their skin, those were the original lullabies. So when you lie awake at night, listening to distant noises, you are participating in a lineage as old as humanity itself. The Nightwatchers still exist, inside us and among us. The light sleepers, the restless thinkers, the ones who keep checking that the fire is still burning. Because somewhere in the long dark of prehistory, a single human stayed awake so others could dream, and that act of quiet vigilance may have been the first form of love our species ever knew. Imagine this. Long before the invention of clocks or calendars, before numbers were carved into wood or shadow sticks traced the sun, the human body itself was the only instrument that could tell time. The first timekeepers were not tools, but rhythms, pulses written into flesh by the turning earth. Even now, deep beneath the noise of electric light, that ancient metronome keeps beating. It counts not hours, but cycles of light and dark, warmth and cold, waxing and waning moons. It is a clock wound by the cosmos tuned to the sky itself. In the late Pleistocene, as humans roamed through shifting climates and expanding continents, sleep did not occur in isolation from the heavens. The body learned to listen to the planet's movement. When days shortened near winter and temperatures fell, sleep grew longer, heavier, more insulated. When light stretched deep into the evening, sleep fractured into shorter intervals, punctuated by the activities of twilight, repairing nets, whispering, watching the stars. There was no need for discipline or schedules. The sun told the eyes when to wake, the air told the skin when to rest. The world itself was the bed. All animals live by this rhythm, a system older than any species that walks or swims today. From corals releasing their eggs under full moons to Arctic mammals sleeping through months of dark, biology has always bent to light. The circadian rhythm, that roughly 24-hour oscillation guiding wakefulness, digestion, and body temperature, is older than multicellular life. Its molecules, like cryptochromes and progenes, still exist across species as though evolution never found reason to discard them. Humans inherited this cosmic machinery and carried it into the savannas, forests and caves where they learned to sleep not merely as bodies, but as participants in planetary motion. Yet while the rhythm itself was ancient, its expression was endlessly flexible. Latitude, season and habitat each sculpted different patterns of rest. Near the equator, where day and night divide time evenly, the cycle stabilized into a steady balance. Sleep aligned closely with darkness, consistent through the year. But as humans moved north and south, toward higher latitudes where sunlight stretched or vanished for months, their circadian rhythm stretched too. Melatonin, the hormone that signals darkness to the brain, rose earlier or later depending on the season. Sleep became longer in winter, shorter in summer, echoing the way other mammals adapt to energy scarcity or abundance. In this way, the body became a mirror of its sky. Even without mechanical measurement, people noticed these variations. They did not think in hours, but in patterns of light. The slant of dawn, the length of shadows, the silence of insects. These were their calendars. Archaeological studies of late Pleistocene and early Holocene campsites show that fire use, tool-making and hunting all shifted seasonally, implying different daily cycles of wake and rest. In colder months, deeper sleep was necessary for energy conservation. In warmer seasons, lighter sleep allowed longer periods of foraging and migration. To live was to flow with the solar tide. And then there was the moon. Long before it became a symbol or a god, it was simply a light that refused to obey the sun. When full, it extended twilight into silver hours, soft enough to move by, bright enough to hunt or dance. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers show that full moons often shorten sleep by an hour or two, not from insomnia but invitation. The glow draws people outward, to socialize, to travel, to observe nocturnal animals. The moon's gravity might move oceans, but its light moved behavior. When it waned, sleep lengthened again, returning to the dark. Across tens of thousands of years, the body learned to anticipate this pulse, a lunar beat overlaid upon the solar one. In this lunar modulation of sleep, humans joined a lineage that spanned the animal kingdom. Fish, insects, and birds all exhibit moon-linked rhythms, often tied to reproduction or migration. In humans, the influence may have lingered as cultural rather than purely biological memory, full moons becoming times of ritual, storytelling, or heightened alertness. For those sleeping in open camps, more light meant greater safety, a temporary easing of fear. The world expanded slightly beyond the fire's glow. When the moon disappeared, the group withdrew into itself, closer, quieter, sleeping longer and deeper. Each month became a small rehearsal of the planet's larger rhythms. Temperature, too, left its signature on the architecture of human sleep. Studies of traditional societies living close to the environment show that body temperature and ambient temperature drop in tandem through the night, reaching their lowest point just before dawn. This cooling triggers the deepest sleep stages, aligning biology with the physics of the Earth's rotation. In colder seasons, humans built thicker bedding or huddled together, not only for warmth, but to stabilize these cycles. The regulation of heat and rest were inseparable. To dream well was to balance thermodynamics. When the Earth cooled during the last glacial maximum, sleep likely adapted as survival itself, longer periods of rest conserving energy when food was scarce, and nights unforgivingly long. The idea that the sky-structured sleep might seem abstract today, but its evidence persists in our biology. Our circadian clock, housed in a cluster of neurons called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, responds almost exclusively to light. When photons hit the retina, they send signals to this region, which then synchronizes hormonal rhythms across the body. Cortisol, melatonin, body temperature, even immune activity follow its pattern. What this means is simple but profound. To close our eyes at night is not to disconnect from the world, but to synchronize with it. Sleep is an act of planetary alignment. In the early Holocene, as climate stabilized after the last ice age, human populations began to settle more predictably. Campsites became semi-permanent, following rivers and herds, and sleep became attuned not only to daily light but to seasonal abundance. Archaeological pollen and isotopic evidence from shelters such as those in southern Africa and the Levant show that sleeping areas were used differently across the year, some layered with fresh plant bedding during wet seasons, others thick with ash during dry periods. Even rest was seasonal. The body and the landscape changed together. This natural flexibility may explain the extraordinary resilience of human sleep systems. Unlike many animals locked into rigid circadian schedules, humans can shift timing by several hours within days, an adaptation perhaps forged by millennia of adjusting to migration, shifting latitudes, and moonlight. Yet this flexibility has limits. When deprived of natural light-dark cycles, the body drifts into what scientists call free-running rhythm, roughly 24.5 hours long. It suggests that the clock inside us expects sunrise to reset it. Without that daily cue, it loses precision. In deep time, this never mattered. The sun always returned. For the first humans who looked upward, The sky was not just orientation but reassurance. It provided the rhythm against which all life measured itself. The slow changes in moon and season were gentle instructions: when to move, when to plant, when to rest. Even today, the body's chemistry remembers these cues. Sleep efficiency increases during long nights, and our mood and metabolism still shift with the seasons. A faint echo of the time when biology and astronomy were inseparable. But there's another layer to this story: the way awareness of time itself evolved alongside sleep. As people began to notice the relationship between celestial cycles and their own fatigue, the sky became a kind of mirror for consciousness. The waxing moon might remind them of hunger returning. The shortening days might whisper of migration. To recognize patterns in the heavens was to recognize patterns in themselves. From this came prediction, the ability to plan, anticipate, and imagine the future. The circadian brain became the forecasting brain. The interplay of light and sleep may also have nurtured early spirituality. In cultures across the world, lunar phases still dictate rituals, harvests, and fasting cycles. These practices are not arbitrary. They encode ancient observations about how light and darkness shape human energy. Full moons bring wakefulness. New moons deepen rest. To live by such rhythms was to live close to the truth of the planet's motion. The body, in this view, was not separate from the cosmos, but one of its instruments. When we reconstruct the nightly world of Pleistocene humans, we must imagine more than fire and predators. We must imagine the vastness above them, the awareness that sleep itself was part of a larger pattern of turning and returning. The stars wheeled, the moon changed shape, the sun returned, and within that endless recurrence humans found safety. To fall asleep was to trust that the cycle would continue. The sky was the first clock, but it was also the first lullaby. Today, scientists still measure remnants of those ancient alignments. Even when cut off from natural light, human sleep follows a faint rhythm synchronized to the lunar cycle. Our reaction times, melatonin levels, and even dream vividness fluctuate slightly with moon phase. No predator now prowls our camps, yet the body still looks for that lost silver light. It seems the cosmos left a residue inside us, a physiological memory of the night sky that once governed every heartbeat. And perhaps that is what made us human in the first place, our capacity to turn necessity into meaning. The rotation of Earth, the tilt of its axis, the dance of its satellite, these became the architecture of our inner world. Long before sundials or calendars, our ancestors slept and woke in tune with the stars. They did not need to measure time because they lived inside it. So the next time you drift asleep, remember that you are performing an ancient ritual of alignment. The neurons firing in your brain follow a pattern set by the same sun that once guided your ancestors across grasslands. Your pulse slows according to a rhythm older than bones. The night outside your window may feel empty, but it is still filled with the same quiet machinery that once told early humans when to rest and when to rise. Sleep, in the end, is not an escape from the world. It is the oldest way of belonging to it. The first walls rise not to keep enemies out, but to keep sleep in. Clay, stone, and timber curve around bodies that once lay under the open stars. The smell of earth replaces the scent of grass. The night, once vast and shared, becomes enclosed, compressed into rooms that echo with breathing, coughs, and the restless movement of the domesticated world. Humanity has begun to sleep inside its own invention. In the early Holocene, somewhere between the fertile floodplains of the Levant and the river valleys of Mesopotamia, the rhythm of human fatigue changed. The transition from foraging to farming was not just an economic revolution, it was a physiological one. For the first time, humans controlled food but lost control of rest. Fields demanded tending by daylight and guarding by twilight. Livestock bleated through the darkness. Infants cried beside clay walls. Work stretched across seasons instead of days, and with it came a new kind of exhaustion. Scheduled, relentless, and domestic. Archaeology gives us glimpses of this transformation in soil, bones, and settlement remains. Skeletal evidence from early farming communities shows higher levels of physical strain, compressed vertebrae, worn joints, and stress fractures from repetitive labour. The shift to cereal agriculture reduced dietary diversity and increased malnutrition, leaving immune systems weaker and sleep more vulnerable to illness. Pathogens spread easily through sedentary populations, amplified by livestock kept close for milk and meat. The walls that promised protection also trapped humidity, fleas, and respiratory infections. The first villagers did not sleep in peace. They sweated and coughed through the night, their bodies adapting to crowding and chronic fatigue. At sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 in Anatolia and Jericho in the Jordan Valley, we find some of the earliest architecture dense enough to alter human circadian exposure. Rooms without windows, narrow doorways, and thick plastered walls blocked moonlight and airflow. The constant presence of smoke from hearths added another layer of sensory fatigue. Experiments on similar reconstructions show that such interiors maintain stable darkness and warmth, ideal for conserving energy, but also for breeding restlessness. In this new environment, night was neither open nor silent. It was heavy. Farming imposed new forms of time discipline. Foragers followed seasonal cues: light, hunger, temperature. Farmers obeyed the needs of crops, irrigation, planting, harvesting, all synchronized to soil and season. Forced sleep to bend around dawn rather than follow the body's own preference. The earliest evidence of labour scheduling comes from Neolithic toolware and storage systems: querns for grinding grain, piles of charred seeds, and burnt clay figurines likely tied to fertility rituals and planting calendars. These artefacts speak of repetition, of predictable rhythms measured not by stars but by sowing cycles. Where the night once belonged to recovery, it now became a pause between obligations. The change was also audible. Villages produced soundscapes entirely unlike the savannah or forest. Chickens roosting, goats shifting, dogs barking, oxen snorting. These were new intrusions into the auditory field of human rest. The addition of domesticated species redefined safety, but also fragmented silence. Ethnographic parallels among early agricultural communities show that people adapted through what anthropologists call polyphasic sleep clusters. Brief awakenings across the night, not out of insomnia but environmental vigilance. The mind learned to filter out familiar noises while remaining sensitive to unfamiliar ones. The difference between a goat's shuffle and an approaching stranger. Sleep itself evolved into a negotiation between comfort and alertness. Another subtle transformation occurred within the home. For the first time, multiple generations began sharing enclosed spaces consistently. Infants, children, and elders slept together on raised platforms of clay or woven reed, sometimes over storage pits where grain was kept dry. The proximity of food and family introduced new biological stresses: rodent-borne disease, insects, and carbon dioxide build-up from shared respiration, but also deeper emotional bonds. Co-sleeping increased nighttime contact, soothing infants and strengthening kin cohesion. In a biological sense, it reduced energy costs by maintaining warmth and protection. In a psychological sense, it reshaped the architecture of trust. We can still read these patterns in the archaeological record. Microscopic analysis of ancient floors at sites like Border Cave and Sibudu in southern Africa, and later Holocene sites such as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒, reveal successive layers of plant matter, ash, and compacted earth. Beds rebuilt over time, their composition shifting as climate, vegetation, and domestic animals changed. In these layers, archaeologists find microscopic traces of sedges, aromatic herbs, and dung beetle fragments. indicating both comfort and contamination. The invention of the bed was now inseparable from the ecology of the household. The human body also responded. With greater exposure to livestock, zoonotic diseases like brucellosis and tuberculosis took hold, affecting sleep through fever, pain, and chronic inflammation. Genetic studies show that immune-related alleles began to diversify rapidly during this period, suggesting natural selection for resilience against microbes, perhaps at the expense of unbroken rest. To survive village life meant adapting not only to labour, but to fatigue itself. The new equilibrium was not about luxury, but endurance. Even circadian rhythm, once guided by the open sky, began to narrow. Artificial boundaries, walls, roofs, smoke, filtered daylight, and altered the intensity of solar cues reaching the retina. People still woke with dawn, but the amplitude of their biological clocks flattened. In effect, early architecture dimmed the world, reducing both light exposure and temperature fluctuation. The human clock still followed the day, but the day had grown duller. The collective sleep of the village became a system of interdependence. When one infant cried, an entire household stirred. When animals rustled, the community became alert. The need for synchronized rest birthed new cultural habits, ritual quiet periods, communal storytelling, and the creation of shared sleeping platforms. These behaviors reduced conflict and noise, effectively turning architecture into a form of behavioral control. The first walls were not just physical, they were social instruments for managing human sound. From an evolutionary perspective, the cost of such density was compensated by social security. More people meant shared defence. More fires meant warmer nights. But the trade-off was subtle. Less depth of sleep, more fragmentation, higher exposure to disease, and new cognitive demands. The human nervous system, finely tuned to the silence of the savannah, now had to tolerate the constant whisper of civilization. The brain's sensitivity to sound during sleep, one of the oldest survival mechanisms, became a liability in domestic proximity. The price of safety was sleeplessness. If we could stand within a Neolithic home at night, the air would be thick with the scent of livestock, grain dust, and smouldering embers. Somewhere a baby would be whimpering, a dog shifting its weight, a hen clucking softly. Light would flicker faintly from the hearth, painting shadows onto plastered walls covered with handprints or bullhorns. The sound of breathing would fill the space, a shared rhythmic chorus of fatigue. Sleep would come, but lightly, always ready to break. The new night also introduced a different kind of relationship with darkness itself. For millennia, darkness had been absolute. Now it was partial, tamed but never eliminated. Firelight cast warmth, but also invited ritual. Shadows flickered, and with them came imagination. The boundary between waking and dreaming blurred. Many early figurines found near hearths and sleeping areas may not have been purely decorative. They could represent symbols tied to protection or fertility, cognitive tools for calming the mind before sleep. The psychological role of night thus expanded. No longer merely recovery, it became contemplation. In these early homes, we can trace the origins of both insomnia and intimacy. The same walls that contained family bonds also contained the noise of thought. For the first time, solitude disappeared from the human night. Dreams now unfolded within walls that echoed back every sigh and whisper. Perhaps this was when humanity first began to think of sleep as both a refuge and a problem. Modern physiology confirms that the environmental stability of indoor life changes sleep depth and duration. Cooler, variable conditions generally improve sleep quality, while warmth and stale air fragment it. Early villages, dense, warm, humid, created precisely the conditions for disturbed rest. Yet despite this, they also nurtured continuity. Parents sleeping beside children created nighttime attachment patterns that echo through culture and psychology even today. In the long story of human sleep, the Neolithic period marks a turning point. The balance between nature and architecture shifted, and the night became a human construct. What began as an evolutionary response to danger turned into a cultural habit. We built houses to keep out predators, then discovered we had locked in our own noise. We domesticated animals for security, then lay awake beside them. Civilization did not end the night. It simply redesigned it. And so, as the Holocene unfolded and fields multiplied, fatigue itself became part of daily life. The rhythms that once belonged to the sky were now hidden behind plaster and thatch. Humanity had achieved safety, abundance and control, but also inherited a quieter form of restlessness. We had learned to make the night our own, but not without losing something of the freedom that once came from sleeping under stars that no one needed to watch. Imagine this. It is winter in a medieval village. The hearth has gone dim, the air smells faintly of smoke and wool, and the church bell has not yet marked the middle of the night. A farmer stirs, not from nightmare or noise, but from habit. He sits up in the darkness, embers reflecting faintly in his eyes. Beside him, his wife mumbles softly, half awake. They whisper for a while about the livestock, the weather, the aches in their hands. Outside, a dog shifts and a cow exhales steam into the cold. Then, after an hour or so, the man lies down again and sleeps a second time until dawn. It was once normal to wake between dreams. For most of recorded history, the night was not one continuous block of unconsciousness, but a landscape with a valley in the middle. Historical documents, from European diaries to African and Middle Eastern sources, reveal that humans once divided their rest into two distinct phases: a first sleep that began soon after dusk and lasted several hours, followed by a waking interval known simply as the watch or the midnight. Afterward came a second sleep, which carried people into morning. This pattern, biphasic sleep, was not a disorder, but a design, shaped by darkness, temperature, and social rhythm long before the world ran on clocks. The first clear mentions appear in medieval manuscripts, legal records, and medical texts. In the early 15th century, a Parisian doctor advised patients to schedule certain medications after the first sleep. An English ballad from around the same period mentions arising after first sleep to say prayers. The pattern appears so frequently that scholars now believe it was the dominant form of rest for centuries across much of the Northern Hemisphere. The two sleeps were not anomalies. They were the heartbeat of the pre-industrial night. Why would such a rhythm evolve or persist so long after the natural world had already imposed a simple day-night division? The answer lies in both biology and culture. Without artificial light, darkness lasted up to 14 hours in winter. Even the most exhausted farmer could rarely sleep through that entire span. Human sleep naturally fragments when exposed only to firelight and starlight, producing two roughly equal halves separated by a period of wakefulness around midnight. In that interval, the hormone prolactin peaks, producing calm alertness rather than full wakefulness, a meditative state that many historical sources describe as tranquil, even blessed. During this middle interval, people did what could be done quietly. Some prayed or read religious texts by candle or hearth glow. Monks structured entire vigils around these hours, reciting nocturnes or matins. Others tended to infants, checked on livestock, stoked fires, or even visited neighbours. In certain communities, while watchfires were communal events, moments to share food, stories, or news before returning to bed. In city households, the wealthy might write letters or contemplate dreams they had just awoken from, interpreting them as divine messages. Sleep was not an interruption of life, but part of its rhythm. A pause, not a disappearance. Even the architecture of night adapted to this rhythm. In northern Europe, bed curtains, shutters and wall-hung draperies created dark cocoons that retained heat and privacy during the long first sleep. After the middle waking, the bed would often be turned or shaken out before the second rest. In some accounts, couples used this time for intimacy, believing conception was more likely during the watch. Others used it for thought. The philosopher Roger Bacon wrote of the silence of the middle hours as the most productive time for reasoning, while 15th century merchants scheduled bookkeeping and correspondence for that same slot. To wake at midnight was not strange, it was efficient. The social scaffolding that sustained biphasic sleep depended on the absence of mechanical timekeeping. Before clocks became common, sleep followed the cues of fire, fatigue and temperature. The house darkened after sunset. Activity resumed naturally when the body said enough. Seasonal variations meant that sleep length and the gap between phases shifted with daylight. During summer, shorter nights compressed both phases into one, or even eliminated the middle watch. Winter extended them, creating the long contemplative midnights described in countless monastic records. The night was elastic, bending with the seasons rather than breaking them into hours. Across cultures, similar patterns appear even where Christianity or European custom had no reach. Among West African and South Asian agriculturalists, anthropologists have noted nighttime routines nearly identical to the medieval first and second sleep pattern. An initial rest, a calm, wakeful period of low activity, and a final return to slumber before dawn. The consistency suggests that biphasic sleep was not a regional quirk, but a global adaptation to long nights and human physiology. In pre-industrial Japan, diaries from the Edo period mention yoi nemuri, early sleep, and ato nemuri, later sleep, mirroring the same structure. Humanity, it seems, has always negotiated with darkness in remarkably similar ways. Science has quietly confirmed this ancient rhythm. In the 1990s, chronobiologist Thomas Ware conducted a series of experiments exposing volunteers to 14 hours of darkness per day for several weeks. Without artificial light, participants spontaneously developed a biphasic pattern. 2 distinct sleep episodes separated by about an hour of quiet wakefulness. They reported this middle phase as restful, introspective, and free of anxiety. Their brains secreted more prolactin and less cortisol, mimicking the hormonal profile of historical Nightwatchers. In other words, when freed from electricity and social schedules, the human body reverted to the medieval night. For the people who lived it, this division was neither disruptive nor deliberate. It was simply how the night unfolded. Literary and religious texts of the late Middle Ages are filled with references to the dead of night, not as a time of fear but of openness. The watch between sleeps became a liminal zone between the sacred and the ordinary. In Christian Europe, it was often associated with prayer. In Islamic cultures, with tahajjud, voluntary nighttime devotion. Both traditions saw value in the hour when the world was still and the mind most receptive. It was not insomnia but communion. Yet the world that sustained the 2 sleeps was fragile. As towns grew and trade accelerated, new patterns of labour and lighting began to compress the night. Street lanterns, first fuelled by oil and later by gas, began to extend evening activity. Church bells and later mechanical clocks imposed standard times for waking and work. What had been a flexible rhythm guided by nature became a schedule ruled by technology. The second sleep began to vanish. By the 17th and 18th centuries, written references to it declined sharply. People still woke at night, but increasingly they regarded it as a problem rather than a custom. The old calm wakefulness had turned into broken sleep. Historians like Roger 𝐓𝐿𝐾𝐒 argue that this shift marked not just a change in sleep but in consciousness itself. The loss of the watch meant the loss of an interior world, a time for dreams to be examined, for thought without labour. The industrial age would soon demand uninterrupted productivity. Even the night had to be consolidated into efficiency. But for thousands of years, humanity had lived otherwise. The night was a frontier, divided by silence and punctuated by waking thought. What would it have felt like to live in that rhythm? To fall asleep with dusk, wake around midnight and feel no guilt or confusion about lying awake? It would have meant existing in tune with natural cycles of temperature and light. Body heat drops in the first half of sleep and rises in the second. The middle watch fits perfectly between these physiological arcs. Dreams too follow this curve, more vivid toward morning. To wake between them might have provided an early form of dream analysis, a chance to recall, record or reinterpret what the unconscious had just offered. In this sense, biphasic sleep was both biological and philosophical, a conversation between night and mind. In villages, the pattern bound communities together through shared silence. One might rise to check on a neighbour's fire or hear faint voices through thin walls, knowing others were awake too. The night was private, but never lonely. Modern anthropologists who study non-industrial societies note that this sense of social connection during nocturnal wakefulness still exists among groups living without electricity. The knowledge that one's sleeplessness is not abnormal, that others are also listening to the night. Perhaps that is what has been lost most in our compressed nights. The understanding that waking is not failure, but participation. The old rhythm accepted interruption as part of the pattern, not a flaw to be corrected. It was a conversation with darkness, not an attempt to silence it. When historians reconstruct this forgotten landscape of sleep, they find a mirror to the way time itself was once experienced. The medieval night was slower, more communal, and more forgiving. It invited awareness rather than demanding escape. The boundary between sleeping and waking was soft. One could drift between them without punishment. In that drifting lay imagination, prayer, intimacy, and thought. By the time the early modern era arrived, with its clocks, streetlights, and regimented labour, the two sleeps had faded almost entirely. Yet traces remain in language. Phrases like the dead of night, middle watch, or burning the midnight oil carry echoes of the interval that once divided dreams. Even today, many people naturally wake in the middle of the night for an hour or so, a vestigial whisper of an older pattern encoded in biology. So when you find yourself awake in the dark without cause or cure, remember that for most of our history that was normal. The body is not rebelling, it is remembering. Long before modern life demanded 8 hours of continuous unconsciousness, our ancestors treated the night as something to inhabit, not escape. The silence between sleeps was never wasted time. It was the oldest conversation between human thought and the turning world. For almost all of human history, darkness was a participant in life. It shaped when we rested, how we thought, even what we feared. Then, almost overnight, we caged it. A small filament in a glass bulb, first patented in the late 19th century, became the moment the Earth's oldest negotiation between light and life was broken. The sun no longer set, it merely changed voltage, and with that, the body's most ancient contract began to unravel. Before electricity, sleep still followed the rhythm of dusk and dawn. Even in the age of candles and oil lamps, light remained expensive and fragile. Its flicker a reminder of time passing. Cities after dark were soft and quiet. Most windows went black by 10 or 11. Then gas lamps arrived in the 18th century, and by the middle of the 19th, electric light spread through factories, railway stations, and homes. Night became optional. For the first time in planetary history, the human species could decide not to rest. The impact was immediate and profound. In industrial cities such as Manchester, Chicago, and Berlin, work shifted from the seasonal rhythm of daylight to the continuous churn of the machine. Factories operated in shifts, mines ran around the clock, and transport networks demanded workers awake at every hour. the night ceased to be a natural boundary and became an economic opportunity. Sleep, once a shared cultural event, fragmented into private necessity. Physiology, however, does not update as quickly as technology. The human circadian system is tuned to a light-dark cycle that has not changed for millions of years. Deep within the hypothalamus, a cluster of neurons known as the suprachiasmatic nucleus measures brightness through the eyes and sets the body's internal clocks, regulating temperature, hormone release, metabolism, and the urge to sleep. When the retinas detect artificial light after sunset, they relay a signal that suppresses the release of melatonin, the hormone that tells the brain it is night. The result is a simple biological confusion. The body believes it is still day while the world outside is dark. This suppression may seem trivial, but it shifts the entire rhythm of life downstream. Melatonin does not just induce sleep. It coordinates thousands of cellular processes timed to nightfall: immune repair, metabolism, and memory consolidation. When its release is delayed, all of these begin late as well. People fall asleep later, sleep less deeply, and wake with a clock that is slightly out of sync with the natural dawn. Scientists call this misalignment social jet lag, the chronic discrepancy between the body's biological night and society's demands for early activity. Unlike travel-related jet lag, this one never ends. It simply resets every morning. In the 19th century, this misalignment began quietly as a side effect of progress. Cities grew brighter and louder, but sleep deprivation was rarely discussed. It was seen as a sign of productivity, an emblem of modern stamina. In New York or London, the sleepless city became a symbol of power. Night work meant industry. Insomnia meant intellect. The physiology of fatigue was treated not as a warning, but as a moral test. Those who needed less sleep were praised. Those who succumbed to tiredness were considered weak. But beneath the celebration of light, biology was accumulating debt. By the early 20th century, scientists began noticing that urban workers slept shorter hours than rural ones. Factory shift logs, railway schedules, and hospital records reveal patterns of chronic exhaustion that did not exist in earlier centuries. The problem was not only duration, it was timing. People were falling asleep later, waking earlier, and sleeping under glare. Darkness itself, once necessary for survival, had become an inconvenience. Electricity also rearranged social life. Evenings once spent around fires or in quiet reflection were replaced with cafes, theatres, and work under bright bulbs. The human experience of the night expanded outward into public spaces but shrank inward in time. Sleep became compressed into a narrower window, its cultural meaning diminished. The phrase, burning the midnight oil, no longer described devotion or prayer. It meant labour or simply entertainment. By the middle of the 20th century, a full night's sleep had become something to apologise for. From a scientific perspective, this was the moment the circadian clock began to lose calibration. Every hour of exposure to light after sunset delays melatonin onset by roughly half an hour. In natural settings, like those studied among hunter-gatherer groups in Africa and South America, the hormone begins to rise about 2 hours after dusk. In electric cities, it often does not rise until after midnight. This means that many people live in a constant state of phase delay, their internal night beginning long after their external one. The invention of shift work intensified this conflict. Industrial production required continuous operation, especially during wars and expansions. Workers in steel mills, mines, and hospitals rotated between day and night shifts, forcing their circadian systems to invert repeatedly. Studies from the early 20th century onward show that few ever fully adapt. Even after decades, the body continues to resist sleeping during daylight. The consequences ripple through health. Disrupted metabolism, lowered immunity, and elevated stress hormones, all born from the simple refusal to rest when the planet does. And yet, There was beauty in the transformation too. Cities illuminated by electricity produced a spectacle no generation before had witnessed. Streets once swallowed by darkness became galleries of glass and shadow. Painters, poets, and photographers celebrated the electric night as a new form of vision. Humanity had extended its sensory reach into hours once reserved for silence. But that sensory victory came at a cost to physiology. The more we lit the dark, the less we could feel the depth of it. Noise, too, changed the architecture of sleep. The 19th century steam engines, printing presses and trains introduced mechanical sound into every layer of urban life. Sleep, once framed by natural rhythms, crickets, wind, water, was now punctuated by whistles and wheels. Anthropologists studying sleep environments describe this as the industrial intrusion, the first time in human history that noise became constant. To compensate, people began closing windows, thickening walls, and retreating into ever smaller personal rooms. The modern bedroom, silent and isolated, was born from the attempt to escape the noise that modernity itself produced. By the early 20th century, science began catching up with what the body already knew. Sleep laboratories emerged in the 1950s, and by the 1970s researchers had identified distinct sleep stages, measurable brain waves, and circadian patterns. They discovered that electric light-delayed REM onset, reduced total slow-wave sleep, and fragmented deep rest into shorter cycles. Ironically, only after mastering the technology that disrupted sleep did we begin to understand what sleep truly was. The industrial schedule also altered our collective psychology. Before the electric day, rest was communal and rhythmic. Afterward, it became solitary and scheduled. The idea of 8 hours of continuous sleep for everyone was a 20th century standardization, a convenience aligned with the workday, not the body. Farmers once napped after lunch, monks rose at midnight, artisans paused at dusk. The electric clock erased that diversity. Sleep became a single unit, defined by economic time rather than personal need. As urban light intensified, even the stars began to fade. For most of human history, the night sky served as both calendar and comfort, a visible anchor for timekeeping and awe. The 20th century erased that connection for billions. Light pollution now extends hundreds of kilometres beyond cities, dimming even the Milky Way. The disappearance of darkness is not only aesthetic, it severs one of the oldest sensory relationships the human brain has known. Where ancestors once synchronized their circadian clocks to twilight, we now live in permanent dusk, trapped between brightness and fatigue. Scientists today can measure this disconnect precisely. Urban dwellers often exhibit delayed circadian rhythms by up to 2 hours compared to those living without electric light. Their core body temperature cycles, hormone rhythms, and brain activity remain misaligned with the natural day-night cycle. The cost is cumulative: reduced deep sleep, weaker immune function, impaired memory, and chronic tiredness. Phenomena now so widespread that they define modernity itself. The electric day, then, was not simply a technological triumph. It was an ecological shift in the human body, a reprogramming of biology to serve productivity. The night no longer demanded surrender. It could be ignored, negotiated, or postponed. But the ancient machinery inside us did not forget. It still expects darkness to signal safety, still releases melatonin at sunset, still prepares to rest with the turning earth. Our neurons remain prehistoric, even as our cities burn like perpetual dawn. If you stand in a metropolis tonight and look upward, you may see the faint reflection of your own lights against the sky, a ghostly dome of brightness hiding the stars. Beneath it, millions of windows still glow past midnight, each one a small defiance against the ancient order. Humanity's conquest of night has been total, but it is also incomplete. The body still carries the memory of the world before electricity, a world where darkness was not an absence but a rhythm, and where sleep was the nightly act of trusting the earth to turn. For 3 billion years, life fought to stay awake. It struggled towards light, evolved eyes to catch it, and brains to respond to it. Then, paradoxically, it began surrendering to darkness. Every night, our ancestors risked stillness in a world that never stopped moving. The reward was survival. Sleep was not weakness, it was wisdom, the body's decision to heal rather than run, to remember rather than fight. And yet, somewhere between the first fire and the first phone, we forgot what it was teaching us. Modern life treats sleep as interruption rather than intelligence. We negotiate with it, cut it short, postpone it as if it were optional. But biology doesn't bargain. Each time we close our eyes, we are not escaping the world but returning to a process far older than our species. Sleep is still doing what it always has, repairing cells, pruning memories, recalibrating the delicate chemistry that keeps thought coherent and emotion bearable. We think of it as rest, but evolution built it as education. Every night the brain reviews its experiences, decides what to keep, and rehearses how to survive tomorrow. When scientists look into a sleeping brain, they see coordination, not chaos. During deep slow-wave stages, neurons fire in rhythmic synchrony, clearing waste and reinforcing essential connections. In REM phases, they replay patterns from waking life, motor sequences, sensory impressions, fragments of thought, translating chaos into coherence. It is as if consciousness steps aside each night so biology can finish the sentence. What the day begins, sleep completes. But in the present age, that teacher has been drowned out by noise, electric light, constant alerts, and 24-hour culture keep our internal clocks permanently disoriented. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, the master circadian pacemaker, still waits for dusk and dawn, but the signals have blurred. Artificial light stretches the day indefinitely. Caffeine postpones fatigue, and social expectation punishes rest. Modern humans live in contradiction, creatures designed for cycles, pretending the world is linear. Yet the old lessons have not vanished. They are buried beneath convenience. Neuroscience keeps rediscovering what our ancestors already knew in their bones, that recovery requires darkness, that rhythm sustains cognition, and that rest shared is stronger than rest alone. Studies of small-scale societies today, though still living without artificial light, show remarkably consistent patterns. People sleep less than the mythical 8 hours, but wake more refreshed. Why? Because their sleep is aligned with temperature, light, and trust. They go to bed soon after dusk, rise before dawn, and rely on community vigilance rather than solitary alarm. Safety is distributed, and sleep, in turn, is deeper. The idea that sleep is social may feel foreign now, but it is ancient. Long before locks and bedrooms, our ancestors rested near others, their vulnerability compensated by collective attention. Even in modern experiments, sleeping in groups has measurable effects: lowered cortisol, steadier heart rhythms, and fewer micro-awakenings. The presence of another heartbeat, literal or symbolic, tells the nervous system that it can afford to rest. The same principle applies at the level of society. Cultures that value rest, through siestas, early evenings, or slow mornings, show lower chronic stress and stronger cognitive performance. The body remembers cooperation. When historians of science trace our relationship with sleep, they often describe a fall from the natural harmony of the Paleolithic night to the artificial glare of the modern city. But perhaps it is not a fall, only a phase. Evolution is adaptation, and we are still adapting to the technologies we have built. The challenge is not to return to some prehistoric ideal, but to remember the logic of the original design. Darkness was never the enemy. It was the reset. Our nervous system evolved expecting a world that dimmed, cooled, and quieted each evening. Those conditions can still exist, if we decide to make space for them. The future of sleep, then, might not lie in invention, but in restoration. Imagine cities that dim rather than blaze, offices designed with circadian lighting that follows natural spectral shifts, neighbourhoods quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat. Imagine schedules that bend with daylight rather than defy it, school starting after sunrise, hospitals rotating shifts with circadian precision, digital tools that pause instead of demand. These are not luxuries, they are biological alignments waiting to be remembered. Even architecture could relearn this ancient dialogue with darkness. Archaeologists have long noted how early shelters used firelight to define communal rhythm, the red flicker marking both safety and surrender. Modern design, by contrast, often eliminates variation, the same brightness everywhere at every hour. Yet our eyes evolve to move through gradients of light, to know when to rest and when to act. The soft fall of dusk, the amber of candlelight, the cool indigo before dawn, these are not aesthetics, they are instructions. At a global scale, rebalancing sleep means redefining progress itself. Productivity without restoration is entropy. Every civilization that forgets this eventually burns out, not from lack of innovation, but from fatigue. Sleep is civilization's brake pedal, the nightly proof that slowing down is not regression, but survival. When societies neglect it, stress accumulates like carbon in the atmosphere, silent, invisible, but deadly in the long run. The irony is that sleep has never been more studied and less practiced. Millions of sensors now measure what was once mystery. We can chart REM density, melatonin curves, and brainwave amplitudes, yet most of us still treat these discoveries as curiosities rather than calls to action. Science confirms what intuition whispered for ages, that each night of deep rest is a rehearsal of life continuing. The teacher has not disappeared. We have simply stopped listening. Perhaps what we owe sleep is not guilt or optimization, but gratitude. Every species that ever closed its eyes risked death to preserve the possibility of another day. We inherited that courage in our biology. When we surrender to sleep, we are not abandoning consciousness. We are trusting an older intelligence built into every cell. The same intelligence that synchronizes heartbeats, heals cuts, and grows memory. Sleep is how evolution keeps talking to itself. It is tempting to think of the modern world as the end of that story, a place where artificial light has severed the link between night and nature. But that view forgets how adaptable humans are. The very capacity that allowed us to conquer darkness can now help us rebuild a better relationship with it. Darkness can be designed, rhythm can be planned, rest can be protected. What evolution once managed through instinct, culture can now manage through intention. We are not doomed to insomnia. We are simply late to our own lesson. So perhaps the question is no longer how much we sleep, but how meaningfully we do it. The first fires taught our ancestors that safety could be shared, that warmth could be planned, that the night need not be feared. Each of us carries that inheritance, the knowledge that stillness can coexist with awareness. When we dim the lights, silence the machines, and close our eyes, we are enacting the oldest experiment in life's history, the art of trusting time. In the end, sleep has never been about weakness or withdrawal. It is continuity. The same cycle that guided microbes through tides now guides our neurons through memory. The same rhythm that cooled the Pleistocene forest still cools the human brain. Each night, when we let go, we are not stepping out of evolution but back into it. And maybe that is what every good night truly is, a reunion with something ancient and kind. When you lie down and feel your body slow, you're not just resting. You're repeating the gesture that kept your lineage alive through predators, plagues, and progress. The darkness you fear is the same darkness that raised you. Every breath in sleep is a small echo of those who survived by closing their eyes beside the first safe fire.